Good morning. I would like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to the first meeting of the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Revenue. Will the Secretary please call the roll?
Senator Doñate, Senator Neal,
Here.
Senator Sievers-Gansert,
Here.
Assemblywoman Considine,
Present.
Assemblyman Hafen, Assemblyman O'Neill for Assemblyman Urick,
Here.
Assemblyman Orentlicker, and Chair Bacchus.
Present. And Secretary, I was not sure if we heard Senator Donati, if he was able to join remotely yet. I anticipated we had 5 currently present with Senator Sievers-Gansert, but it looks like she stepped away from her chair. Oh, there she is.
I'm here.
Thank you so much. What we'll do is please mark those that come in present when they arrive. I would like to welcome our audience and committee members here in Las Vegas, as well as those in Carson City and anyone watching or listening over the internet. If you have not done so already, please mute all of your electronic devices. Persons wishing to testify today, please sign in at the table by the door. Before beginning to testify, please present a business card to the committee secretary and state your name clearly for the record. First, we're going to move on the agenda item number 2, which is opening remarks. As a reminder, Assembly Bill 443 from the 2021 session created the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Revenue. This committee mirrors the standing committee during the legislative session. The Joint Interim Standing Committee on Revenue is a permanent committee of the legislature that is tasked with evaluating and reviewing issues within the jurisdiction of the Assembly Committee on Revenue and the Senate Committee on Revenue and Economic Development during the 83rd session of the Nevada Legislature. Today, we have a few housekeeping matters, and then we will have presentations by the National Conference of State Legislature, NCSL, and by our fiscal staff. First, though, I would like to start with introductions. I am Assemblywoman Shea Bacchus, representing Assembly District 37 in Clark County. I am honored to have been chosen to serve as chair of this committee. During the interim, I'm hoping we're able to listen to presentations that could be considered for policy going into the 84th session. And with that, we'll kind of snake around our room here in Las Vegas for introductions, and then we'll go up to Carson City, and then if Senator Donate has joined us on Zoom, we will go to him. So with that, I will go ahead and start with our Vice Chair, Senator Neal, for her introduction.
Good morning. I am Senator Dina Neal. I've been on this, well, I've been on revenue. Let's just say I've been on revenue since 2011. And it's awesome to be here. And I represent Senate District 4.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here. Assemblywoman Venetia Considine. I represent District 18. I have been in revenue since my first year in the Assembly, which was 2021, and excited to get started. Thank you.
Assemblyman David Orentlicker, also in revenue since I joined the Assembly in 2020, and I'm on the southeast side is my District 20. Thanks.
We'll go ahead and go up. We'll start with Senator Sievers-Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Senator Heidi Sievers-Gansert. I represent Senate District 15, which is in Washoe County, the west side of Reno. I was in the Assembly for 6 years, starting in 2004, and have served in the Senate since 2016. I've been a member of this committee for the most, I think, since I've been a senator. Thank you.
I'm Assemblyman P.K. O'Neill, Assembly District 40, known as the capital District, naturally representing all of Carson City, Story County, and the eastern side of Washoe County up to the city of Sparks and along the Reno City line. I've been on revenue. I served in 15 and then came back in the last 2 sessions, and actually I'm an alternate filling in for Assemblyman York. I look forward to doing the work that I can, and I'll transmit the information over to Assemblyman York, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Assemblyman O'Neill, for stepping in today as an alternate. We appreciate your service. With respect to broadcast, do we have Senator Donate online by chance?
Thank you, Chair. Senator Donate has not had the opportunity to join as of yet.
Thank you so much. With that, we'll go ahead, and I also want our staff that supports our revenue just to go ahead and introduce themselves. And with that, I'll go ahead and start with Mr. Nakamoto.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize for bringing the weather with me from Carson City. I am Michael Nakamoto, Chief Principal Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division. I have been in this role for just over a year now, but I have been part of LCB Fiscal and part of the tax team since November of 2005. So the upcoming session will be my 10th legislative session, primarily working on the Assembly side, but this is my first session working both sides. Madam Chair, did you want me to introduce the rest of my team? Okay, thank you. Up in Carson City, we have Christian Tower, who is working his first interim committee. He started with the Bureau after the 2019 session, was on the program side of our office during the 2021 session, and joined the tax team during the 2023 session, primarily working with Senator Neal on the Senate Revenue and Economic Development Committee side. We also have Susanna Powers, who started with our office last summer after working for about 8 years with the Governor's Finance Office as their economist. This is also her first interim committee, and she spent the session assisting the chair of this committee with the Assembly Committee on Revenue. At this point, I think I should also introduce, we have a new staff member on the tax team. We are now a team of 4 instead of 3. During the last legislative session, this body or the legislature approved an additional position for the Fiscal Analysis Division specific to the tax team. So Haley Owens is our brand new economist who started back just after Thanksgiving, actually right before Thanksgiving. She is at the meeting today. No, she will not be at all of the meetings, but she has various duties that she'll be working on behind the scenes, including the stress testing. That is one of the responsibilities of our division. But I just wanted to make sure that Ms. Owens was here today so that you all could see her. She came to us previously from GoEd, but before that she was at the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Employment Training and Rehabilitation, and spent a few years as the economist for the Department of Taxation. We actually, I believe, have 2 secretaries for today's meeting. We started with Tom Weber, who is our Assistant Office Manager, assisting us with the meeting. Since that started, though, we have a new secretary in the Fiscal Analysis Division, Maria Aguayo, who's only been with us for a few weeks, but she's not new to the Bureau. She spent about 10 years in the Research Division, and I am really glad that we have her, and I'm also glad that we have her assisting us with this committee. And that's all I have for in terms of the fiscal staff, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would also like to recognize that we also have 2 legal counsels that also support our committee. That is Joe Steigmeyer and Brian Fernley, who both work in LCB Legal Division. And they will be available to us and should be on our hearings via Zoom. I just want to just kind of, for housekeeping measure, our agenda today should not run a full day, so we will not break for the lunch hour. With that, we will move to agenda item number 3. and this is the time for public comment. I just would like to express that I would hope that comments can be kept down to 2 minutes per person. And we will also have public comment again at the end of the meeting in case you are just listening and are not able to make your public comment at this time. First, we will start with Las Vegas. Is there anyone here in Las Vegas wishing to make public comment? Next, we'll go ahead and go up to Carson City. Is there anyone in Carson City wishing to make public comment this morning? Okay, last but not least, BPS, is there anyone on the phone line who would wish to provide public comment?
Thank you, Chair. The public lines are open and working. However, there are no callers to offer public comment at this time.
Thank you so much. With that, we'll go ahead and close public comment, and we'll go ahead and move on to item number 4 of our agenda, which is adoption of committee policies. Members, you should each have before you a copy of the committee policies. The committee policies are a combination of policies that were established during the 2023 legislative session between the Assembly Committee on Revenue and the Senate Committee on Revenue and Economic Development. The policies have been adjusted slightly to accommodate a joint committee during the interim. Do any of our members have any questions regarding the committee policies? With that, I will go ahead and accept a motion to adopt committee policies.
I make the motion to adopt the committee policies.
Second.
Thank you so much. I have a first from Vice Chair Neal and a second from Assemblywoman Considine. Is there any discussion on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Is anyone opposed? The motion carries. Next, we will go ahead and move to agenda item 5, a presentation on trends in state taxation and the outlook for 2024 by Eric Syverson, who is a senior policy specialist with the National Conference of State Legislatures. Mr. Syverson is presenting over Zoom. So Mr. Syverson, when you are ready, please feel free to begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee, and thank you for having me speak in front of you today. Like the chair said, my name is Eric Syverson, and I'm here to give a high-level overview and trending state tax policies and outline what the 2024 legislative sessions are shaping up to be as it relates to state tax policy. In case you're not familiar, NCSL is committed to the success of all legislators and legislative staff. Our mission is to ensure state legislatures have a strong, cohesive voice in the federal system, to improve the quality and effectiveness of state legislatures, and promote policy innovation and communication among the state legislatures. We're here to be your resource in providing technical assistance and responses to legislative requests, and to provide testimony and presentations like the one I'm giving today. I'm going to be touching on 3 topics today. The first will be state tax trends from this previous year, 2023, as well as a look at the previous 2 years, which are historic as it relates to state tax policy. The second will be the approaches states have taken to provide tax relief, specifically looking at income and property taxes. And then the third item will be an outlook of the 2024 legislative sessions as it relates to state tax policy and state fiscal conditions. Starting with state tax trends, across the country, we saw states continue to provide tax relief. According to us in the Tax Policy Center, at least 48 states have cut taxes in some way, shape, or form since 2021. These acts were made possible by the growth in state revenues, which is attributable to several broad factors, one of which being strong economic resiliency during and after the pandemic. A robust labor market, heightened consumer spending, and a bullish stock market, plus a soaring housing market, have enabled increased state and local tax collections. Additionally, federal pandemic-related spending buoyed state coffers. We saw over $500 billion allocated from the American Rescue Plan alone to state and local governments. According to the Pew Charitable Trusts, the share of states' total revenue from federal funds climbed to a record high nationally in fiscal year 21 to 36.7%, which will remain elevated through the end of this fiscal year when most of the ARPA dollars will be obligated. And according to NASBO, the vast majority of states, 46 of them, recorded revenue surpluses for the third consecutive year in a row last year in 2023. This chart from the recent fiscal survey of states by NASBO demonstrates the tremendous growth in general fund revenue nationally, both in nominal and inflation-adjusted dollars. While 2023 and the projected 2024 show relative declines in revenue growth, remember this is compared to fiscal years 2021 and 2022, which were historic in how much states collected in state tax dollars. Although Nevada does not impose an income tax on individuals, I want to dive into specific state tax reductions that states have enacted over the previous few years as it relates to income taxes. Since 2021, half of all states have cut income tax rates, which includes 23 rate reductions to the top marginal rates in states. Income taxes are usually the largest source of revenue for state governments, making these cuts notable and historic in their adoption across the nation. In 2023 alone, we saw the following states reduce their individual income tax rates: Arkansas, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Utah, and West Virginia. I wanted to highlight some state approaches to these policies to give an example of how income tax cuts have created a downward pressure on income tax rates across the nation. After Ohio passed HB 33, Ohio's 2 income tax brackets will be simplified, merging the 4 brackets previous law into 2 by this tax year. Additionally, there will be a reduction to the top income tax rate bracket from 3.99% to 3.75% last tax year. Further streamlining is planned for this tax year, 2024, consolidating the 2 top income tax brackets and lowering that rate to 3.5%. Additionally, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear signed into law HB 1, which lowers the state personal income tax rate retroactive to 4.5% last tax year and 4% effective this tax year. States have also looked to benefit taxpayers through additional methods, such as tax expenditures. At least 13 states have enacted or expanded their earned income tax credit by allowing more incomes to qualify for the credit, making the credit fully refundable, or simply increasing the percentage of the credit allotted to taxpayers based on the federal EITC. States use EITCs to provide targeted tax benefits designed to help low to moderate income working people, especially those with children. What's more, we've seen further activity from states regarding child tax credits to enhance the economic security of families with children. This year alone, Minnesota, Oregon, and Utah joined the growing number of states that offer a state child tax credit, amounting to 14 states in total across the nation. At least 5 other states either expanded their credit, made it refundable, or more generous in this past year as well. Relatively high revenues exceeding expenditures also prompted 6 states to issue income tax rebates. For example, Alabama issued $150 to single filers and $300 to joint filers, costing the state $393 million of its $2.8 billion surplus. Virginia passed a similar rebate, giving $200 to individual filers and up to $400 to joint filers last year as well. Finally, we saw several states of the 11 that still tax benefits reduce tax burdens on Social Security recipients. States either allowed a higher percentage of the benefits to be excluded from income for tax purposes, or in the case of Missouri, entirely phased out taxing benefits altogether. Compared with individual income taxes, corporate tax cuts were not as prevalent this previous year, or the past 2 years. Since 2021, only 14 states have cut corporate income tax rates. And in 2023, we only saw 3 states, Arkansas, Nebraska, and Utah, reduce their corporate income tax rates. Again, I wanted to look at the states that have actually reduced their corporate income tax rates, and here are a few examples from Nebraska and Utah. Nebraska enacted LB 754 last year, which flattened Nebraska's corporate income tax. The previous corporate income tax was 5.58%, on the first $100,000 of corporate income in the state and an additional 7.25% on income beyond $100,000. Under the previous law, Nebraska's top corporate income tax rate was also scheduled to go down to 5.84% by the 2027 tax year. This bill, which was enacted last year, consolidated Nebraska's two-rate system into a new flat rate of 3.99% by the tax year 2027 instead. Utah also decreased its corporate tax rate, in addition to its income tax rate, from 4.85% to 4.65%. I wanted to mention that the corporate income tax has been gradually eroded and declined as a source of state government revenue over the years. This is a long-term trend that tax analysts have been grappling with, prompting some states to find new sources of revenue from business activities. Corporate income used to account for 9 to 10% of state tax collections as early as the 1980s, but is now only half of that. Some of the commonly cited reasons for this include an increase in tax planning opportunities. Businesses are shielding more of their income, and states are growing the amount of economic development tax incentives that they provide. What's more, the ongoing shift of S corporations and pass-through businesses filing through the personal income tax code, which up until recently had a more favorable treatment at the federal level. Roughly 90% of American businesses are now pass-through entities. And finally, changes to apportionment formulas in states used to determine tax liability for multi-state corporate taxpayers, which have been increasingly altered in ways to benefit large corporations with a lot of payroll and property in state and a lot of sales out of state. Finally, in response to rising housing costs and evaluations across the country, many states are considering offering ongoing or one-time property tax relief measures. In 2023 alone, we've seen 14 states enact relief. This comes in the form of homestead exemptions or circuit breakers, which we'll discuss a little later. Colorado, for instance, called a special session to provide property tax relief after Proposition HH failed to pass muster in the November elections, whereas voters in Louisiana and Texas agreed to ballot initiatives to offer property tax relief ongoing in their states. Compared with income and property taxes, states have not cut sales tax rates, and in the preceding 3 years, despite a flurry of legislation as it relates to state tax policy and healthy state revenue collections. Only 2 states, New Mexico and South Dakota, reduced rates since 2021. Instead of rate reductions, states are more likely to provide sales tax exemptions or enact holidays as forms of tax relief. In contrast with sales taxes, excise taxes have bucked the overall trend of tax relief and have posed as a new source of revenue for state governments. States have been willing to place taxes on newly legalized activities like gambling and marijuana. Additionally, the trend of increasing rates of taxation on tobacco and e-cigarette products has continued, especially as states look for ongoing revenue streams to fund priority investments. The sales tax faces some of the most difficult barriers in the modern world, which may explain the lack of sales tax relief in relation to other taxes. For many, the ideal sales tax would fall on all final consumption, but state sales taxes don't really live up to that ideal currently. A growing number of consumer purchases are also not subject to sales tax in most states. The chart on this slide shows personal consumption of goods compared to services. Back in the 1930s, when most states enacted their state sales taxes, tangible goods accounted for most personal consumption, and services were left out of the state sales tax bases because they posed some trickier administrative challenges. Today, services account for about 70% of all personal consumption, and many of those transactions are not subject to the sales tax. The digital era has also contributed to an eroding sales tax base. Many tangible products are now being replaced by intangible digital versions, which are not usually taxed. This is not a new development, but only half of the states tax digital products or streaming services currently. There's been a continuing shift towards electronic commerce as well, which has accelerated after the pandemic. Online sales are now 21% of total retail spending. Very recently, we've seen that all the states with sales taxes enact laws allowing for the collection of taxes from online sales, but there are still exemptions for small sellers in every state and ongoing challenges with bringing foreign sellers into compliance. Then in addition to all of these challenges, you have legislatively enacted exemptions and sales tax holidays that further cut into sales tax revenues. Due to the narrowing of the state sales tax bases over the years, statutory rates have only gone up gradually. The median state sales tax rate was 3.25% in 1970 and roughly stands at 6% today. Switching gears a little bit, we have a good idea of what states are doing, which is providing targeted tax relief. Now I'd like to briefly highlight some common ways states are doing that by looking at how they're providing specifically income tax relief and property tax relief. As we discussed, a lot of states have reduced income tax rates across the country. For most states taking this approach, the changes in tax rates are not effective usually immediately. Instead, states are prone to phase in effective lower rates over the course of several years, up to and including 5 fiscal years, to properly analyze and account for actual lost revenues. In addition to rate reductions, 2 new states have joined the others in adopting flat income tax rates. In 2022, Georgia and Iowa enacted flat income tax rates. That means now 13 states have flat income taxes across the nation. Going into 2023, the push for taxes was not over. Governors in several states proposed and enacted state sales tax or state income tax rate reductions like we highlighted. There are also calls for eliminating income taxes across the country. Eliminating the income tax is a highly contentious proposition in most states, however. Replacing the average state's most productive revenue stream could lead to budget instability and would increase the overall regressivity of a state tax system. Those with lower incomes typically spend about 3/4 of their earnings on items which are subject to the sales tax, whereas top earners spend about 1/6 of their income on items that are taxed. To the extent that states continue to reduce income taxes, more reliance will inevitably fall on the state sales taxes, the second largest revenue source for states. Some economists who favor state sales taxes say that taxing consumption is less economically distortive and conducive to growth instead of taxing income. For homeowners in 48 states and Washington, D.C., property tax relief is available in the form of homestead exemptions and property tax circuit breakers. Starting first with homestead exemptions. They come in 2 varieties: as a credit against the property tax due, or as an exemption from the tax on a portion of the property's value. State eligibility requirements vary for these type of policies, but exemptions commonly target people over the age of 65, veterans, people with disabilities, and people who meet low-income thresholds. However, some states offer all homeowners an automatic exemption on a set amount of the value of their property. Several states have unique homestead exemption programs, which I wanted to mention. Wisconsin, for example, is the only state to offer homeowners a property tax credit that changes value based on the gaming and lottery revenue collections the state takes in that year. Nebraska has a graduated exemption that increases in value as applicants' incomes decrease. Massachusetts and Texas have adopted a similar system for veterans with disabilities, where the exemption increases based on the degree of disability. Similarly, Hawaii has a basic exemption of $40,000 for people under the age of 60, but the amount increases for people in older age brackets. That is contrasted with circuit breaker tax credits. Under most circuit breaker tax programs, when a property tax bill exceeds a certain percentage of a taxpayer's income, the circuit breaker reduces property taxes more than this, quote, overload level. The term circuit breaker was coined in the 1960s to describe the programs that protect family income from property tax overload, similar to how electric circuit breakers protect home from excessive currents. At least 29 states offer circuit breaker programs currently, with eligibility requirements again varying widely. 16 states have age or disability requirements, or both, and the remaining 13 states have only maximum income limits as a requirement. An important distinction between property tax circuit breakers and homestead exemptions. Circuit breaker programs can provide relief to renters who qualify based on their rental payments. However, only 11 states offer circuit breaker programs for renters, and the number has dropped 50% in the last 20 years. Moving on to the third topic today, and I'll end by looking at fiscal conditions and how they will impact the potential tax policy reform in states this year, as well as highlight some tax policy proposals floating around in state houses already. First, we know, according to the Urban Institute's reporting, that state revenues are weaker heading into fiscal 24 than they were in fiscal 23 and 22. State government tax revenues from major sources declined 11% in real terms in FY 2023 compared with FY 2022. That was largely driven by income tax decreases. State personal income tax revenues decreased 19.9% in real terms in FY 2023 compared with 2022. That is also bolstered by the decrease in state corporate income tax revenues, which decreased by 10.8% in the same time period. State sales tax growth remains, but it is weaker than it has been in the previous 2 years. We saw that state sales tax revenues for state governments increased 0.7% in real terms in this previous fiscal year. Personal consumption is still growing, but increases are highest among services. Spending on goods are down alongside energy goods and services, which is largely due to the lower energy prices we're seeing across the nation. A report from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis is insightful, and from September 2023 shows that household excess savings still stand at about $430 billion nationally, which was built up by folks over the pandemic. However, most of it is held by the top half of income earners, and meaning that some of the spending that we've seen over the past 2 years could be further cushioned through the end of this fiscal year. Property tax revenues remain strong for local and state governments, but not as strong as you would think. Despite soaring housing residential property values, commercial properties have actually declined significantly. High interest rates have cooled housing prices in some markets, which may weaken for future property tax revenues going forward. We also know that state tax cuts are influencing revenue collections. Steep declines in personal income and corporate income tax collections are attributable to rate reductions enacted by states, as I discussed over the past 3 years. In fiscal year 23 alone, states enacted tax cuts amounting to $16.2 billion, representing the largest nominal reduction in revenues on record, according to the Urban Institute again. Cuts are made to further economic development, but the timing of these cuts could be bad if economic conditions worsen, creating pressure on some states, which could lead to budget imbalances. However, we know that states have record high reserves, which will grant them some cushion in the years to come. While revenues are beginning to show signs of slower growth and weakening, it's not true across the nation. Most states have higher than normal levels of reserves. Large rainy day funds could help ease the transition to slower revenue growth for the states seeing the lowest amount of growth. Large rainy day funds could help ease the transition, like I said. For instance, NASBO data indicates that states have aggregate rainy day fund balance of 13.5% of total general fund spending, with some states having access to other resources like general fund surpluses and other balances not formally counted as rainy day funds. The key questions for state rainy day fund remain: when and how much will states draw down reserve balances? After use, can we expect states to replenish? Or what is the normal level at which rainy day fund balances will normalize? The path forward remains uncertain, but because state revenues have become increasingly volatile. This is due to a number of factors. We saw, like I mentioned previously, states are increasingly reducing rates. State tax rates have not been stable over the past few years, which makes forecasting difficult. Additionally, states are relying on more volatile sources of revenue. For instance, the growing line across the nation on income taxes may be problematic, as some revenue depends on non-wage income, like stock options and capital gains. States also depend on severance taxes, which are seen as largely volatile because of their large fluctuations in prices. But if economic conditions worsen and revenue collections continue to deteriorate and do not stabilize, states will be forced to seek revenue or enact spending cuts in the coming years. The key questions facing state budgets are: how will the labor market change in the next few years? Will wage gains continue, albeit at a slower pace, or will growth stagnate? What will growth in services versus goods consumptions look like? And are interest rate reductions around the corner? How will this impact housing prices and the market overall? And I want to end today's presentation by looking at what we've seen across the nation in terms of governor's state-of-state addresses and the prospect for tax reform in 2024. There are still governors and state legislatures pursuing tax cuts in the upcoming legislative sessions, but analysts predict fewer states will reduce rates in 2024 compared with the previous 3 years. Income and property tax relief will continue to be the major tax policy areas for states looking to enact cuts. The map in front of you today showcases the states in which the governor has proposed tax reform in their state of the state addresses. While not all governors have given their address, at least 13 governors have signaled their desire to cut taxes in the upcoming legislative session as of last week when I checked. The degree to which these policy goals will translate in legislation remains to be seen, however. That is it for me today. Thank you so much for having me speak before the standing committee, and I'm happy to take any questions now, any of which I cannot answer. I will follow up with a written response in the next few days, but thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Severson. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Severson or any comments regarding the presentation? I'll turn it over to Vice Chair Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you didn't really say this, but I guess what I was picking up when you said that, over time we've lowered corporate taxes, but maintained or increased sales taxes. So in a way, we've shifted the tax burden. And so I wanted to make that statement because there's been some national conversation about trying to move a poverty tax. I haven't necessarily wrapped my arms around it, but I'm trying to, I guess, not just throw it away as a concept, but really try to understand what would be the impact, to even consider a poverty tax. How do you make it uniform? How do you make it equitable within the climate that you kind of described, right? We're helping corporations, but then putting sales tax on consumer activity.
I don't know if there's a question in there, but that is an interesting idea, Senator.
Yeah, well, the question is, so the poverty taxes, I'm not really clear on what they do, what they're about. So there's one saying give relief to seniors. I don't know how that works in real life because not all seniors are equal. Like in the state of Nevada, we have a lot of seniors that are financially stable and in really good positions, and then you have some that are not. So how would you even consider putting a poverty tax relief program for seniors when you have this discrepancy within wages?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know really how to operationalize what a poverty tax is, and especially in the case of Nevada without an income tax. But as it relates to how other states are addressing low or moderate income wage earners or senior citizens without incomes, we've seen they've taken several routes. Like I mentioned, they target property tax relief so that they reduce the amount they're paying on their homes if they have them. They also provide some exemptions as it relates to goods that they commonly purchase for those specific populations. But as it relates to an overall property tax, like you indicated, it's a very conceptual idea right now in states. And I would have a hard time understanding how it would translate to states without income taxes imposed, because a lot of other aspects of property tax include tax credits similar to the earned income tax credit, which provide either credits against taxes owed or at least refundable tax credits to wage earners to offer them more of their income back as it relates to the tax code. But like I said, it's highly conceptual. A lot of these programs would be targeted at specific populations. I'm sorry if that doesn't answer your question, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, no, I brought it up because AARP has been pushing a senior relief tax program, and I haven't necessarily accepted that as an idea or thought pattern, but I just wanted to have some more conversation around what that could look like, because we are a non-income tax state, but that doesn't mean that our seniors don't need something. I just don't know what it is. But can I ask another question, Chair, on a different topic? Absolutely. So I want to kind of just really briefly talk about when we talk about what's happening with corporations and tax relief within corporations, there's been this conversation nationally about don't tax my business inputs, right? And that is a common phrase and it's a common term, just business input. But it's never broken down as what all falls into the category of what business inputs are, right? Like what's the range? So if a corporation was to come in and say, don't tax my business inputs, what then would be the list of the things that are excluded? Because they never break that down. Can you help at least illuminate what that is or how to ask the appropriate question on what are you really trying to get me to exempt from your tax base or from your bottom line as a corporation? Because it's not clear. It's just a general statement. And business inputs is more than one thing to me.
Right. And I think that is a very important question to consider, just because it is a common refrain you hear that taxing business inputs is considered to be tax pyramiding by tax analysts, that you want to avoid taxing those inputs because you want to avoid duplicate taxation. You want to have tax fairness across the system in which you are taxing businesses. Senator, the frank answer is it depends really on the industry we're talking about. We do provide exemptions or credits for certain business inputs. If you think about like wholesaler exemptions or credits that states offer to business wholesalers, those are sometimes referred to as inputs. Like I said, that really depends on the industry. I'd love to follow up with you with a written response to discuss a little bit more about what business inputs could be defined as relates to various industries and how you can pose more questions that are more targeted at the industries that you're interested in.
Okay, so I'll just give you the heads up and so you can just write this back to me. This is a huge conversation. This is a huge conversation in digital goods. Don't tax my business inputs. And we know that that's a huge category. Digital goods is several things, several companies, but the narrative is don't tax my business inputs. And I'm not clear on what that means and what the implications of that is, and they don't break it down, but it is becoming just a common thread throughout all of the national tax meetings that I've been going to, which is you can do a digital goods, but don't tax my business inputs. And I'm like, well, that's like 20, 30 companies that are doing a range of services.
Okay, I will definitely follow up with you on that.
Thank you so much. Next, we will go to Carson City to Assemblyman O'Neill.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a much simpler and easier question, I think, to answer. On one of the slides at the beginning, you talked about states that reduce their income tax. And I just need clarification. As I recall, Florida and Texas do not have a personal income tax. And you were talking
That is correct, yes.
that they lowered the personal income tax. You
Let me
included them
just
in
go
that
back and see.
group. Give me a second, I'll tell you what's, I don't have your slide number, it's our page 13.
That is probably a mistake on my behalf. You are correct. I know of the only two states that do not impose an individual income tax on individuals are New Hampshire and Tennessee, that have taxes on capital gains, which are included usually in income tax. But yes, Texas and Florida should not be included in that list, and that is my mistake.
Do you know what others, if I may, the other states that do not have personal income tax? I know Nevada is one of them.
Let me just see here. That would include a number of states: Alaska, South Dakota, Washington, Florida, Texas, Tennessee, New Hampshire, like I said, Wyoming, Nevada. I'm trying to think of what else. I think that might be all of them. And Montana does not levy a state sales tax, as well as a few other states like Oregon.
I just wanted to get that clarified because I think it may change some of your statistics or the rest of remaining information on income taxes, just number-wise, percentage-wise, when you exclude those states that you said did lower their taxes when they don't even have an income tax. That's just what I was asking.
That is correct. Yeah, the number is correct. It's still 23 states, or at least half the states since 2021, with 23 top rate reductions since 2021. But Texas and Florida should not be included in that list. That is correct.
Well, how did Montana enact a tax cut if they don't have an income tax?
Montana has an income tax. They have no state sales tax though.
Oh, I thought you said Montana didn't. I apologize.
It's all good.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Assemblywoman Considine.
Thank you, Chair. On your slide on property tax relief, when you were talking about the circuit breaker tax credits, you mentioned that those circuit breaker tax credits can provide assistance or tax relief to renters. Can you expound on that, explain how that works? Or I'm just curious how that works when they're not the property owners.
Yeah, it really just depends, but ultimately, instead of using property taxes as it relates to income, they're indexing their rental payments. So they provide as a form of a tax credit, usually as an income tax credit, to those rental payers as it relates to their percentage of income versus how much they're expending on rental, on the rent as it relates to their home. It's just the same thing, but different for property taxpayers, which are usually homeowners. There are a few programs that provide the relief directly to the property owner, which then is expected to pass on that relief to renters. But most of these programs are a little bit older and they're targeted to the rental payers exactly. And they're in the form of an income tax credit.
Thank you. Can you tell me some of the states that are currently doing that?
I would love to follow up with you. I don't have the states in front of me, but it's only 11 of them, and I can give you detailed information of each of them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Severson. I did have a follow-up with respect to that because I'm not sure if we would refer to it as a circuit breaker tax credit here in Nevada, but this last session we expanded our property tax exemption to certain types of affordable housing receiving certain benefits, whether it be tax credits. Before it was limited, and we expanded that this last session. So my question was with respect to these circuit breaker type benefits to renters, does that extend also to like single family residents that are rented out by the owner?
I would have to check, to be honest with you, the varying state policies, but it probably includes all rental properties. Like I said, the primary index is the person's income. So if a person is able to rent a single family home and has an income such that it qualifies for these circuit breaker programs, then most likely yes. But like I said, the devil's in the details as it relates to varying state policies.
Thank you so much, Mr. Severson. Do we have any other questions from our members? I don't believe so. With that, we appreciate your time today and your presentation. And we'll look forward to receiving that information regarding the questions asked by Assemblywoman Considine and Senator Neal. And with that, we'll go ahead and move on to item 6 in our agenda, which is a presentation on the tax changes approved by the legislature during the 2023 session and the Economic Forum on May 1st, 2023, as well as forecast for fiscal year 2023, fiscal year 2024, and fiscal year 2025. With that, we have our own Mr. Nakamoto here ready to present, so feel free to start when you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Again, for the record, my name is Michael Nakamoto. I am Chief Principal Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division of the Legislative Council Bureau. And just as the usual disclaimer, all of us who will be presenting to you today from the Legislative Council Bureau are your nonpartisan staff. We work for all 63 legislators, regardless of House, regardless of party. And that applies not only during session, but also during the interim. So if any members of this committee, or for that matter, any members of the legislature have questions about tax revenue budget issues, they can be sent to us. We may not be the right people to answer the questions, but if we are not the right people to answer the questions, we will get you to the right people. So I believe I have the longest agenda item today, at least in terms of volume in the packet. So but I'm not gonna go through everything in there because all of you will hate me by the end of that if I do. But I will start on page 31 of the packet, which is the first page of the Economic Forum's May 2023 forecast. And if you've been around long enough, you understand the drill that the Economic Forum immediately before session and then during session approves forecasts that are used. The December forecast is used by the governor in building the executive budget, and then the May forecast is used by the legislature for approving a budget that is then passed and becomes law for the upcoming biennium. But after the legislative session, staff to the Economic Forum, that is those of us in the Fiscal Analysis Division, will go through and make revisions to that forecast based on legislative actions that were approved during the regular session or any special sessions as appropriate. And so the first several pages of the agenda item 6 are the adjusted forecast for the Economic Forum based on the legislative actions approved during the 2023 regular session as well as during the 35th special session. And we'll talk about that as we get through that. So I'm not going to go through this entire portion of the packet, but the first 3 pages, pages 31, 32, and 33, are the taxes that are part of the unrestricted general fund. So you have things like the sales tax, the gaming taxes, the modified business tax, the insurance premium tax, the real property transfer tax, and so on. These are predominantly revenues that are collected by our Department of Taxation, but the gaming taxes are, of course, through the Gaming Control Board. And so when you get to the bottom line, you can see forecasts of total taxes after tax credits, and we can talk about the tax credits a little later if there are questions about that, of anywhere between $5.2 billion and $5.4 billion per fiscal year. So on page 34 of the packet are licenses and fees and fines. These are collected by some of the other agencies and deposited into the state general fund. So you can see under licenses, there's a block that's collected by the Secretary of State's office. Under real estate, those are from the real estate division, obviously from the Department of Business and Industry, the State Athletic Commission, and then under fees and fines, you have some more from the real estate division. The short-term car leases from the Department of Taxation, and then you can see some others dealing with the water engineer and the Supreme Court and so on and so forth. And then on page 35 is use of money and property, and so these the top half of this is predominantly repayments. So there is legislation passed just about every session where the state general fund essentially loans money to an agency for a specific purpose, and there is a repayment of that loan. You can see most of these are dealing with EATS, or the agency formerly known as EATS, over in the Department of Administration. The last one under the repayments before the state motor pool, though, is the City of North Las Vegas repayment for the Windsor Park relocation, which was approved as a result of Senator Neal's bill, SB 450. And then at the bottom of use of money and property is interest income, and specifically from the state treasurer, who administers that based on the investable balance that the state has. And we will definitely talk about that more as we get into this agenda item. And then lastly, under other revenue, this is just basically anything else that didn't necessarily neatly fall into a lot of these categories, starting with the Hoover Dam revenue, which is an annual payment made by the federal government for Hoover Dam, which has been paid, to my recollection, since the 1930s, since Boulder Dam was originally constructed, and then going forth to miscellaneous sales and refunds. And then you get to a bottom line of around $5.7 and then climbing to about $5.9 billion of total revenue per fiscal year out in FY 2025. So the next pages after this are all footnotes that discuss legislative actions that affected the state general fund starting with the 2019 session. Every session we add new notes for legislative actions and we take an old batch off. So if you looked at this sheet 2 years ago, you would have seen 2019 session actions all the way through the 21 session. But now we're at the 2017 session all the way through the 21 session, but now we're starting at the 19 session because we've added the 2023 session. So there are notes going all through this talking about the various adjustments that were made and the legislative actions that were taken. And then on page 39, you can see explanations and legislative actions that affected tax credits, including on page 40 at the bottom, the most recent one was Senate Bill 1 of the 35th special session relating to the transferable tax credits that will be issued for the baseball stadium at the southeast corner of Las Vegas Boulevard in Tropicana. So on page 41, the tables that I'm going to go through, these are tables that your fiscal staff puts together for our appropriations report. And this is actually a little bit duplicative of some information that we provided to the Economic Forum, but I figured we would go through it just in some high level. So basically, Table 1, it goes through the Economic Forum's forecast before tax credits and without adjustments approved by the legislature, and then starts talking about the tax credits. So we have an explainer of the tax credits, how they work, what they're for, and then the revenue amounts that are subtracted from the forecast for each of those that were approved by the Economic Forum. So on page 41, you've got the commerce tax credit, which allows a business to use up to 50% of their commerce tax liability in a fiscal year against their modified business tax liability in the following fiscal year. And so that you can see the totals there. And then it starts getting into the other tax credit programs that were approved by the legislature. So the film tax credit program that was originally approved by the legislature in SB 165 of the 2013 session. And then on the next page is the economic development transferable tax credits that were originally approved in Senate Bill 1 of the 29th special session. And those were the tax credits that were supposed to be for the Faraday Future project out at Apex in North Las Vegas that never went forward. But some of those tax credits were approved by the Interim Finance Committee right before session, and that's the amount that is on there. On page 43, we have a discussion of the Educational Choice Scholarship Tax Credit Program and the various changes that have been going on with that, as well as the forecasts for those tax credits for FY 23, 24, and 25. On page 44 is the Nevada New Markets Job Act tax credit program, which was originally authorized during the 2013 session, reauthorized for another period during the 2019 session, and there was legislation that was approved during this current session that will begin the program again, starting, I believe, in FY 2027. And then on this page, on page 45, we've got some of the other smaller tax credit programs. The Catalyst account, which is, to my understanding, not currently being used by the Office of Economic Development. The College Savings Plan Employer Matching Employee Contribution Tax Credit Program that is administered by the Treasurer's Office, and then the Affordable Housing Transferable Tax Credit Program, which is administered by the Housing Division of the Department of Business and Industry. And then on page 46 is just the total, which gets us to the forecast after tax credits and then without adjustments for legislative actions. Table 2 begins on page 47, and this is where we start talking about some of those tax actions. And I'm not going to go through all of them, at least at a detailed level, but I will make mention of most of what is on these pages. So SB 124 The first bill that is listed under taxes on page 47 dealt with the net proceeds of minerals tax. And this was legislation that was approved by the legislature and signed by the governor very early in session. It was during February. And basically what it did is it amended provisions originally approved in Senate Bill 3 of the 31st special session back in July of 2020. And as you'll recall, that was right during the pandemic. And so there were concerns about the budget and about revenue during that special session or during the pandemic itself. And so SB 3 of the 31st special session required the prepayment of the state general fund portion of the net proceeds of minerals tax for FY21, FY22, and FY23 based on each mine's estimated proceeds that they thought that they would have during that the current calendar year. And so the legislature in SB 124 decided to switch that back a year early and say, okay, in FY 2023, you do not have to make this estimated payment. You just have to true up your previous estimated payment based on your actual activity. And part of the reason why this occurred is during the 2021 session, the legislature in Assembly Bill 495 decided instead of having this general fund portion of the net proceeds of minerals tax go to the general fund, they decided to send it to the state education fund instead. So the end result of this is because the legislature chose to do this, instead of making that estimated payment in FY 2023 to the state general fund and having no payment to the state education fund in FY 24, they accelerated that so that there would be no payment to the general fund in FY 23, and then in FY 24, the mines would make their actual payments based on their calendar year 2023 activity, and that money would go to the state education fund. So it took money out of the general fund in the past fiscal year, put it in the education fund next fiscal year, and basically ensured that that money would go to K-12 education. There is no estimated impact on here because it was current law when the Economic Forum met on May 1st. So it was built into our forecasts, which was approximately $1.4 million for FY23. And then because it is now in the state education fund beginning in FY24, there is no forecast. So we did not have to make any adjustments for that. The next legislation that is on this particular page is a Senate Bill 428, which requires the submission of a ballot question on the November 24 general election, seeking approval to amend the Sales and Use Tax Act of 1955 to provide an exemption from the state sales and use tax and for local taxes, if it is approved, for adult and children's diapers, which would become effective if the ballot is the ballot question is passed on January 1st, 2025, and would remain in effect until December 31st, 2050. We put this on here because the effect on the general fund is not known. It's not known whether there will be any because it requires the ballot question to be passed, but we are putting it on here as a possible action or an action that will possibly affect general fund revenue going forward, and especially in the last half of FY 2025. SB 266, the last bill on this page, excluded entry fees for certain contests run by gaming establishments from the percentage fees on gross gaming revenue. This is a bill that did not come through the revenue committees, and as you can see, this is a bill that does not have a significant impact on the state general fund because the entry fees did not constitute very much in terms of what is considered gross gaming revenue for the purposes of that tax. On the next page, on page 48, we'll start with SB 435, which deals with the insurance premium tax, and then specifically it deals with a provider tax that may be imposed by the Department of or the Division of Healthcare Financing and Policy of the Department of Health and Human Services against certain providers. And so The bill that was passed by the legislature says that if such a tax is to be imposed, the proceeds from the tax have to be used to provide certain support and services under Medicaid. And what ultimately that means is if the tax is to be imposed, and it is my understanding that the tax will be imposed at some point here in the near future, the proceeds that are used for Medicaid services have an impact upon the insurance premium tax. The capitation payments that are made to the Medicaid managed care organizations are considered net premiums for the purposes of the insurance premium tax, and therefore would increase revenue. We just don't have any way, or did not have any way at the time, to calculate what the impact would be, because we did not know what the rate was going to be. So once that is established, we can anticipate that there may be some more insurance premium tax revenues, but we're not sure how much that would be, or may possibly be. The next bill is Assembly Bill 448. Which deals with the real property transfer tax, and this was the Speaker's bill that clarified that the exemption from the RPTT for certain businesses or mere changes in identity, form, or place of organization do not apply if the business entity to which the real property is transferred was formed for the purposes of avoiding those taxes, and that was effective upon passage and approval. We did not have any estimates at the time because we were waiting for the Department of Taxation to impose regulations or to adopt regulations relating to this particular bill. My discussions with the Department of Taxation within the last week have indicated that they are still working on that regulation process. They do have an affidavit and some forms that they're working with the county recorders in terms of enforcing the provisions of this particular bill until they get those regulations into place. But as of right now, we don't have any additional information beyond that. Next is SB 452, which dealt with the governmental services tax. And this is a portion of the governmental services tax that was originally approved during Senate Bill 429 of the 2009 session, which increased the depreciation schedule for all vehicles by 10%, except with the exception of new vehicles, which already are at 100% on the depreciation schedule. And then it took that 10% increment and originally put it into the state general fund for several fiscal years, with the idea of eventually putting it into the state highway fund. There were a number of pieces of legislation between 2009 and 2023 that shifted those percentages around to the point where it would go for 50% to the state highway fund, 50% to the general fund, 25% to the state highway fund, 75% to the general fund, 100% to the general fund, 25% to, and so on. But there were a lot of pieces of legislation that dealt with this bill. SB 452 finally ended all of that and took what was under current law 25% to the state general fund and 75% to the state highway fund, and said beginning in FY 2024, 100% of the proceeds go to the state highway fund, and none of these proceeds go to the state general fund. And then finally, under taxes is Assembly Bill 232, which deals with the other tobacco tax, which is the tax that is imposed on tobacco products other than cigarettes at a rate of 30% of the wholesale price. AB 232 further segmented it out such that tobacco that is designated as a premium cigar, instead of being taxed at the 30%, there's a minimum tax of 30 cents and a maximum tax of 50 cents. If the tax or the 30% calculation goes below or above that, it's forced within that range. And so the estimates of that we had were a loss of approximately $1 million per fiscal year. So then you can see the net impact of total taxes, which is a reduction of approximately $30 to $31 million per fiscal year for this biennium. Before I move on to licenses, Madam Chair, is this a good point to stop and see if there are any questions?
Sure. With that, and do any of our members have any questions regarding presentation? We'll go ahead and start with Assemblywoman Considine.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I just had a question back on page 35 under other revenue, miscellaneous sales and refunds. The first line under that is expired slot machine wagering vouchers, which seems very high. So I guess my question is, do those expired, the funds from that fully come to us, or is this the amount of the tax based on those?
Thank you, Madam Chair. To Assemblywoman Considine, Michael Nakamoto for the record. I'm pulling up the memory banks here on this particular tax, or revenue source. So the Gaming Control Board specifies, to my recollection, that those wagering vouchers that you get when you put money in and you take your however much you get out of the slot machine, they expire after 180 days. And after they have expired, the gaming establishment is required to turn over 75% of those proceeds to the state, with the 25% remaining with the gaming establishment. So I guess this is the amount of revenue that's received, so this is the 75% that we get. So I am guessing that those people who do not turn in their vouchers or redeem them for pennies or a couple of dollars, I guess they add up over time. So that is basically what that particular revenue is.
Mr. Nakamoto, I just have a question, and I think if memory serves me right, I may know the answer. That same page, page 35, under use of money and under 3290, the treasurer for interest income, we see in fiscal year 2022 about $24 million in revenue from interest income, and then we have a significant jump for fiscal year 2023, and then it starts tailoring off for fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025. Is included in that revenue that's obviously generating interest monies from the federal government, like under ARPA and COVID relief funds?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. Michael Nakamoto for the record. The very short answer to that is yes. As you as a member of the Interim Finance Committee are aware, because it always comes up on every single agenda, there is a lot of money that we have received from the federal government for coronavirus relief and through ARPA. And there is the guidance, or what little guidance we have, basically says that the interest that is received from that money is credited to the state general fund. So the $24.2 million of interest income you saw, that had a little bit to do with receiving that money. It also had to do with the interest rate conditions, because in addition to having received a significant amount of federal money that is to be doled out by the end of calendar year 2026, the interest rates have been very favorable for the treasurer to do his job and invest the balance not only in the general fund, but in other funds as well. And so that is the reason for the forecasts to increase decidedly in 23, 24, and 25. But as the money is spent and as interest rates decrease, and I'll get a little bit more into that as part of either this agenda item or another agenda item, we can expect that revenue source to go back to what is more of a historical normal, which is the FY20, FY21, FY22 amounts, maybe a little bit more than that.
Thank you so much. With that, members, do we have any other questions? Okay, I'll go to Assemblyman Orlichter and then come back up to Senator Neal.
Assemblyman Orlichter for the record. Thank you for the presentation. Couple of questions. One, this college savings plan, employer matching, is there it looks like it's hardly being used at all, right? One employer is doing this for one employee, or?
Assemblyman Orant Liquor, Michael Nakamoto for the record. This is about the average of what it has been. As you can, if you look at the page that's up, page 35, you can see the actuals for FY21 and 22 are around that $500 a year. The maximum contribution or the maximum credit, I believe, is $500. So I have not confirmed it with the Treasurer's Office, and I could do that upon your request, but it seems to me that there may only be one person participating in this program.
Thank you. And my other question, it looks like when you total up the credits, it looks like it's 1% of total revenues go to credits, but the commerce tax credit seems to be separate. So is it 1% goes to commerce tax credit and 1% to all other tax credits? Is that where we're at, 2% roughly, which doesn't seem, fortunately, that high?
Assemblyman Orant Liquor, Michael Nakamoto for the record. That is correct. The math there does kind of line up to total credits being about 2%. And the reason why back after the 2015 session, we decided to break out the commerce tax credits separately from the other tax credit programs is because the commerce tax credit kind of is a function of the tax code, that it's a specific reduction against the modified business tax, whereas the others are programs that are for special purposes that may go against multiple revenues. For example, the film tax credit can be used against the modified business tax, the gaming percentage fee, or the insurance premium tax. And over the history of that particular tax credit, it has been taken against all three of those. But because the commerce tax credit is kind of uniquely tied to the commerce tax and the MBT, and it's a function of the tax code, if you will, we broke those out separately. But you are correct. When you add the two together, we're in the neighborhood of about 2% of total general fund revenue that gets lost due to tax credits.
If I could ask one more question. So is there any low-hanging fruit in terms of uncollected taxes? Is there an area where there's people not paying taxes they should be that would be a significant amount of money that we might focus on?
Assemblyman Orant Liquor, Michael Nakamoto for the record. That's a kind of a dangerous question to ask your nonpartisan staff. What I will note is that there are periodically, and we actually had one during the pandemic, a period of tax amnesty that was run by the Department of Taxation that basically said that if you have uncollected taxes, you can basically pay them without penalties and interest for a certain period of time. And my understanding is, my recollection is that we thought that it would bring in to the general fund somewhere around $14 million. And I think the end result is it brought in far less than that. It might have been about $4 or $5 million, and I can follow up with the Department of Taxation on that to see if they have recollection on how much that is. But I think that might be one of the bigger areas is from time to time, there are simply taxpayers who do not pay their taxes, and then the Department of Taxation or the relevant agency goes and chases them. In terms of other taxes or things that we could address, that's, as your nonpartisan staff, I don't think that it's appropriate for me to comment in that direction.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Senator Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it's on SB 435. And I don't know if you know this, and I don't know if you said this because I might not have been paying attention. Has the Department of Health Care Financing actually passed the regulation in order to try to get an assessment? Because I pulled it up to try to understand what were the provisions that trigger this assessment from the hospitals, private hospitals. And it sounds like it's from money that they're generating, but they needed to pass a regulation in order to determine how much can be taken from the revenue generated in order to form an assessment. Has there been movement on this policy?
Senator Neal, Michael Nakamoto for the record. I will acknowledge that my previous conversations with the staff in our office who deal with Medicaid have been not so recent, so it was probably before Christmas that I had the conversation. My understanding was that there was movement on getting the regulations done, and that's really what they were waiting on. I will follow up with them, and I will get an answer to you on what the status of the provider tax is and the regulations to support it.
Okay. Yeah, because it passed June 8th. It was effective June 8th, and we're now in end of January. So my second question is on AB 45, which is basically it allows for,
Sorry, I can't call an MMI.
I consider it like I guess a leftover tax. So it has the language in there that loan repayment will go to providers of health care in underserved communities after the $7.6 million goes into the Millennium Scholarship. But how much is it actually generating so that anything left over can actually go to the student loan repayment for providers of health care in underserved communities?
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Michael Nakamoto. You got ahead of me, so I had to figure out what you were talking about. If you turn to page 35 of the packet, and so it's the last page of the Economic Forum forecast, so you can see the unclaimed property under GL 3255. It's the very last revenue before you have total other revenue of $42.1 million in FY23. 39.4, almost 39.5 million in FY24, and 39.6 million in FY 2025. This is the amount of unclaimed property revenue that is forecast that is net of those transfers. So we'll just suffice it to say that there is sufficient revenue to make all of those transfers and then have leftover revenue to the state general fund.
Okay, so I moved ahead of you, but I was wondering because the second box, and I don't know if the negative 2.75 and then the negative 5.5 for the biennium, because it looked like there was blank. So if there had been any disbursement for the account on student loan repayment, has there been any payout to those folks?
Madam Chair, Senator Neal, Michael Nakamoto for the record. I will have to look in the controller system to see whether those transfers have occurred yet, and I will get back to you. But yeah, I would have to look to see if the transfers have been made because I honestly do not know if they have been yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions from any of our members down south or up in Carson City or by Senator Donate, who's now joined us on Zoom? With that, I would thank Mr. Nakamoto for his presentation. Oh, just kidding. I forgot we were going to our second session. Let's go to the table 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michael Nakamoto for the record. I was not kidding when I said that this was going to be the longest agenda item. So on page 48, under licenses, this one is fairly straightforward. Assembly Bill 260, which my recollection was that this was Assemblyman O'Neill's bill, provides an exemption from certain Secretaries of State office fees under Title VII of the NRS for what are defined as veteran services organizations. And that took effect on January 1st of 2024. And as you can see, that was a very minimal effect to the state general fund because I believe that there are not very many of these organizations based on information that was provided to us by the Secretary of State's office. On page 49, you can see under fees and fines. Senate Bill 145 made some changes to the fine structure that can be imposed by the Labor Commissioner for violations of provisions relating to misclassification of employees by an employer, and it removed a first offense fine of $2,500. And so the Labor Commissioner estimated that there were approximately 4 of these that were levied per year. So it's a reduction of about $10,000 per year to the state general fund. Under use of money and property, I discussed a little bit about the repayments. So you can see for the first 4 of those that are through the Division of Enterprise Information Technology Services, which now has a new name that I don't remember. Those are noted on here as legislative actions from the 2023 session, but there is no revenue involved with them because the repayment is not supposed to take effect until FY26 into the next biennium. The one repayment that does show up on here is the Windsor Park relocation repayment from the City of North Las Vegas. The Senate Bill 450, which was Senator Neal's bill, provided a general fund appropriation of $12 million to the Housing Division for the Windsor Park relocation from that neighborhood in the City of North Las Vegas. The repayment of those funds is withholding of $250,000 per month of North Las Vegas's consolidated tax or C-tax revenue until the $12 million is paid off. So that actually was to take effect in FY24, so you can see $3 million per year, and that will go through FY27. So that's $250,000 per month times 12 gets you to the $3 million. On page 50, under other revenue, we have a court administrative assessment fee that is imposed by districts and municipal courts relating to certain violations. And under the old law, $5 of this fee was to go to the state general fund, and then there is a remainder portion that is used to support various programs within the state through the court administrator, the criminal history repository, and so on. During this last session, the legislature approved Senate Bill 448, which just said instead of using these proceeds to fund these programs, the balance of the assessment would go to the state general fund, and then the legislature decided to fund those programs through direct appropriations. So it's not an increase in the fee, it's just shifting the money around. And this is money that would have gone to those programs and is now going to the state general fund in the amount of approximately $15.6 million per year. The cost recovery plan is the statewide cost allocation is money that is part of the state budget. It's money that's essentially returned to the state general fund, and then that has an adjustment at the end of each legislative session because we're working on forecasts. But then once the legislatively approved budget is finalized, then we have a final amount, and so it resulted in a reduction. And then unclaimed property, Assembly Bill 45, which Senator Neal asked questions about, which requires additional transfers from the abandoned property trust account, money that would have otherwise gone to the state general fund, which now goes to various purposes, in addition to the $7.6 million per year that goes to the Millennium Scholarship Fund. So the end result of the legislative adjustments from these actions was a reduction of approximately $15.3 million in revenue in FY24 and approximately $16.2 million in FY 2025. And that gets to the bottom line number there of before tax credits and with adjustments for measures approved by the legislature in the 35th special session. Then the next page on table 2 discusses tax credit programs and the commerce tax credit. There are 2 pieces of legislation that are listed there that are adjustments to tax credit programs. The first is Senate Bill 240, which is Senator Neal's bill dealing with the New Market Jobs Act, which makes various changes to that program effective July 1st of 2024. But the way that that is set up, none of the tax credits may be used against the insurance premium tax until the beginning of FY 2027. So there is no estimated impact from that bill in this biennium. And that was done by design because of the previous legislation from the 2019 session, which has credits running through FY 2026. And then finally on this page is Senate Bill 1 of the 35th special session, which dealt with the baseball stadium that I've previously mentioned. Beginning in FY 2026, the developers of that project are eligible to receive $36 million per year in transferable tax credits for a period of 5 years. That, again, does not affect this biennium, but we noted it as a legislative action that will affect the general fund beginning in FY 2026. So on page 53 is the last part of Table 2, which deals with the State Education Fund. And we mentioned SB 124 there as well because that bill affects the net proceeds, which is in the State Education Fund beginning in FY 24. And then a very small bill dealing with Department of Agriculture fines, AB 523, which increased revenue to the State Education Fund by approximately $11,000. So this is the total bottom line for those two significant funds of approximately $15.3 million in FY 24 and $16.2 million in FY 25. Then on, I'm not going to go through the entirety of Table 3, but pages 55 through 61 discuss the tax credit programs and go through the legislatively adjusted forecasts, which are actually the forecasts that were approved by the legislature. The exception to that is on page 61, where we have the write-up of the baseball stadium again. And then so you can see the bottom line there of the forecast after tax credits, and this will tie back to those economic forum sheets. So the last part of Agenda Item 6 that is included is another section of the appropriations report, and this is what we call the tax policy section. And so after the legislative session ends, your staff, that is Mr. Tower, Ms. Powers, and I will go through all of the legislation that may have affected taxes or other revenue. And so this is not only the legislation that was approved as part of the Revenue and Economic Development Committee in the Senate or Assembly Revenue Committee, but anything that may have affected taxes, revenues, or other important fiscal policy, or at least possibly important to us, fiscal policy that may have been approved in the money committees or another policy committee within the legislature. So this particular write-up, again, is part of our appropriations report, and so we've left the page numbers in the middle at the bottom of where it is in the appropriations report, in addition to the packet page. So we start on page 63, and at the bottom of 63, we go through a number of bills that affected state revenues and taxes. And so a lot of these are bills that you would have seen or that were seen in the revenue committees. So on page 65, for example, we have AB 232 at the bottom, which dealt with the premium cigars. But then there are some other bills that are part of this that were not. So, for example, Assembly Joint Resolution 5, which is the question of the constitutional amendment regarding a state lottery, was included in this, as well as AB 45 that Senator Neal had asked about relating to the unclaimed property. And then, for example, on the following page, on page 66, Assembly Bill 430, which made various changes to the cannabis tax. This was an Assembly revenue bill that was passed and became effective on January 1st. And then, so these are bills that are may be relevant to the state general fund, they may be relevant to the state education fund, and they may be relevant to other funds or accounts within the state. And they may have been finance or ways and means bills, and they may have been revenue bills, or they may have come from somewhere else. But this first section, pages 63 through 68 deal with the bills that are dealing with state taxes and state revenue. So on page 69, we have bills starting there dealing with technical and administrative changes to various tax laws or that things that may affect tax laws. So for example, on page 71, we talk about Senate Bill 50, which is the bill that was brought forward by the Department of Taxation to revise the sales tax holiday for National Guard members and the various changes that were made to that. So on page 72, we talk about bills regarding tax credits, abatements, or exemptions, abatements, and postponements. So anything that deals with tax exemption, tax credit, tax abatement, or so on, that gets discussed in this. So for example, at the bottom of page 72 and going into page 73, we discuss Senate Bill 429, which was Senator Flores's bill dealing with the abatement provisions in NRS 360.750 relating to employees receiving FMLA benefits that was originally vetoed by Governor Lombardo, but then the provisions were brought back in Senate Bill 1 of the 35th special session relating to the baseball stadium. And you can see on page 73, we have a write-up on the baseball stadium as well because of the tax credits that were involved there. On page 74, we get into state and local economic development. So the bills that deal with the workforce innovation and GOED and all of the various bills that were heard primarily in the revenue committees this session are included in there. And so, for example, at the end of page 76, you've got SB 240, Senator Neal's bill dealing with the Nevada New Markets Jobs Act. And then on page 77, we have bills dealing with local government taxes and revenue. And where appropriate, we make notes about various things that happen with the bills. So, for example, on this particular page, you can see Assembly Bill 359, which was Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno's bill relating to the fuel tax indexing here in Clark County, and the ballot question that is currently required with that. That bill was vetoed by Governor Lombardo. Is one of 3 bills that were relevant to the revenue committees that were vetoed by the governor this legislative session. And then on page 79, the very last bill, but not the least bill, is Senate Bill 450 dealing with Windsor Park. So that is really all I had with respect to going through the agenda item or the materials in the packet for the agenda item. Just as a final note, though, Madam Chair, I thought it would be interesting, having paid attention to the Commerce and Labor JISC that happened last week, and that there were specific agenda items relating to the bills that were vetoed. I thought it would be interesting just to kind of go through a recap, a high-level recap of what the revenue committees did this last session. So Assembly Revenue heard a total of 40 bills, of which 30 of them were Assembly bills. And of those 30 Assembly bills, 11 of them were passed and signed by the governor. 18 failed. They did not receive further consideration at any point. And then 1 was vetoed, and that was Assembly Bill 359, Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno's bill. There were additionally 2 resolutions that were considered, and both of those did not receive further consideration by the entirety of both the Senate and the Assembly. On the Senate Revenue and Economic Development side, there were 27 Senate bills that were heard, of which 7 were passed. 18 did not receive further consideration, and 2 were passed by both houses of the legislature and subsequently vetoed. I mentioned Senate Bill 429, which was vetoed by the governor and then brought back as part of Senate Bill 1 of the 35th special session. The other bill that was approved by both houses of the legislature and then subsequently vetoed was Senate Bill 400, which was Senator Neal's bill dealing with homelessness and continuum of care and the like. With that, Madam Chair, that is all that I had for Agenda Item 6. I appreciate your time, and I stand ready for any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nakamoto. I apologize to trying to expedite your presentation, but the whole presentation is very much appreciated. With that, I will open up questions to our members. Do we have any members down here in Las Vegas? No one appears to have any questions down here. Do we have any folks up in Carson City who wish to ask any questions? With that, I thank you once again for your presentation, and we will go ahead and close this agenda item and move on to agenda item number 7, which is a report and discussion of fiscal year 2023 actual collections compared to the Economic Forum from December 3rd, 2020, May 4th, 2021, December 5th, 2022, and May 1st, 2023 forecast adjusted for legislative actions approved during the 2023 third session and the 34th and 35th special session. And with that, we will welcome our fiscal staff, Mr. Tower, to the dais. And I can't see up in Carson City, but I assume he's hopefully made his way there. And so feel free to start when you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. For the record, I am Christian Tower, Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division. And I will be presenting on Agenda Item 7 today, which begins on page 81 of the meeting package. And I will also bring the respective table up on the screen. So on the screen, hopefully, and on page 81, you see Table 1, which compares actual revenue collections with adjusted forecasts for selected major and non-major revenue sources for fiscal year 2023. If you look at the column structure of the table, there are a total of 4 different forecasts for fiscal year 2023, 2 per forecast cycle. On the left-hand side, you will find the December 3rd, 2020 and the May 4th, 2021 Economic Forum forecast for fiscal year 2023 as the second or last fiscal year of the 2021 to 23 biennium. These forecasts projected revenues for fiscal year 2023, 2 years in the future. Towards the right-hand side of the table, you find the December 5th, 2022 and the May 1st, 2023 Economic Forum forecast for fiscal year 2023 as the current year or first year of the 2023 to 2025 biennium. These current year forecasts made projections on general fund revenues for fiscal year 2023 on the basis of up to 8 months of actual revenues already received in fiscal year 2023, and were thus forecasting the remaining month of the ongoing year. Naturally, moving from the left-hand to the right-hand columns in the table, the variance between forecast and actual revenue collections tend to decrease. Forecasting the remainder of the year on the basis of actual revenues already received in that year tends to come with a higher forecast accuracy than forecasting revenues 2 years in the future. Also, as a reminder, the December 2020 and May 2021 forecasts were made under the impression of the COVID-19 pandemic-induced economic disruptions and the associated significant uncertainty as to the economic situation in the years ahead. Turning to the rows of that table, in the first set of rows of the table, you will find actual and forecast revenues for the sales and use tax for fiscal year 2023. You see the actual collection of approximately $1.722 billion in bold. Underneath, you find a row with the Economic Forum's forecast for fiscal year 2023 and information on the difference between the forecasts and the actual collections. In the rows under the Economic Forum forecast, you find the agency, fiscal division, budget division, and Moody's forecast as presented to the respective Economic Forum's meetings. While the Economic Forum decides on the forecasts, It does so against the background of forecasts presented during the Economic Forum meetings by forecasters, namely respective state agencies, the Fiscal Analysis Division of the LCB, the Budget Division of the Governor's Office, and Moody's. Moody's provides forecasts only for the state of Nevada's two most significant revenue sources, the sales and use tax and the gaming percentage fee tax. Underneath the sales and use tax, the table also features the gaming percentage fee tax, and the insurance premium tax, the live entertainment taxes, and then on the following pages, information on other major and non-major revenue sources. So on page 82, you see information on the commerce tax, the modified business taxes, real property transfer tax, and other major revenue sources. On page 83, you find information on select non-major general fund revenue sources, such as the cigarette tax, the governmental service tax, business license fees, liquor tax, other tobacco tax, and commercial filings. Page 85, you see information on film tax, on tax credit programs. And finally, on page 86, you find the total general fund revenues net of tax credit programs. And you see there that actual net general fund revenues were $5.762 billion in fiscal year 2023. These actual collections were thus approximately 24% over the Economic Forum's December 2020 forecast. They were just about $43.8 million, or 0.76%, over the Economic Forum's May 2023 forecast. And I will now move to Table 2 on page 89 of the package. As Table 1, Table 2 provides information on actual versus forecast revenue collections for fiscal year 2023. Different to Table 1, however, Table 2 only provides this information with respect to the December 2022 and May 2023 Economic Forum forecasts, and thus does not include the two-year ahead forecast for 2023, and also does not include information on the forecast presented to the Economic Forum by different forecasters, such as the Agency, Budget Division, Fiscal Analysis Division, and Moody's. Table 2 instead includes a detailed account including all general fund revenue sources. So in that respect, the table is identical, listing all the revenue sources as the table Mr. Nakamoto already presented under Agenda Item 6. And the table includes the actual revenue numbers for fiscal year 2023 and fiscal year 2023, and the Economic Forum December 22 and May 2023 forecast for fiscal year 2023, as well as the difference between the forecast and actual revenues per revenue source. And if you scroll through the table, you see the same set of revenue sources as Mr. Nakamoto already presented. So it starts with the net proceeds of minerals tax and the mining taxes, and Mr. Nakamoto has already presented the legislative actions on these taxes, so I will not repeat that here. Underneath, you find information on the sales taxes, first starting with a 2% state sales tax. Underneath, you find commissions for the collection of local state taxes, which also are remitted to the general fund. Underneath, you find information on gaming taxes, beginning with the gaming percentage fee taxes. Underneath, you find live entertainment taxes, the commerce tax, transportation connection excise tax, and cigarette taxes. On page 90, you see the modified business taxes, continuing page 91, followed by the insurance premium tax and other insurance taxes. And this continues, and finally on page 93, on the last line, you find information on the total general fund revenues after tax credits. And with that, I would conclude my run through these tables and would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tower, for your presentation. I see that we also have Mr. Nakamoto back up here, probably ready to answer any questions that we may have. Does anyone here in Las Vegas have any questions regarding Mr. Tower's presentation? We'll start with Senator Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I don't know if I'm missing this. I'm looking on page 94 for AB 445, which is the marketplace facilitator. I don't see what is it for FY '23? What is it generating?
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. We do not separately break out the marketplace facilitator portion of the state 2% sales tax. That was a footnote that we put after the 2019 session just to indicate that we had adjusted the forecast to take that into account. We would likely need to make a request to the Department of Taxation to find out the taxes that are collected from the businesses that they have identified as marketplace facilitators. And so we can do that and get that information for you.
Okay, thank you for that, because that's what I was wondering, because, I mean, in the footnote, I'm just super curious. And then also, are we just sticking with these tables? Because I had marked the non-gaming LET increases, which seem to be, that's on page 81. And the agency forecast is 18.66%, and then fiscal was 8.28, and then budget was 4.80. So just wondering about the discrepancies here. Why the agency has a much higher number for the non-gaming, which we know are the concerts and sports teams, maybe.
Senator Neal, Michael Nakamoto, I'm on the sports teams. I'm not going to go there. With respect to the forecasts, each of the forecasters that are presenting their forecasts to the Economic Forum, the agency in this case, because we're talking about the non-gaming LET, is the Department of Taxation. The Fiscal Analysis Division has their forecast, and then the Budget Division, which is the Governor's Finance Office, their economist has their own forecast as well. And so I can't speak to the forecasts by the agency or the Budget Division, speaking on behalf of the Fiscal Analysis Division, and I will let Mr. Tower actually expand on this if he has additional comments, because it was his forecast. We looked at events that we knew were occurring, and we kind of made assumptions on what we thought was on the calendar, what we knew was going to be on the calendar, and various economic conditions that may have driven the forecast in FY23. What I will note is if you look at the previous column, the December 5th, 2022 forecast, you can see that the Fiscal Analysis Division's forecast for the non-gaming LET was approximately $59 million, and we revised it to $73.3 million, and we still were $6.6 million off of the actual collections. And what ended up happening is we for our forecasts, both in December and May, we had forecasts built in for ticket sales for Formula One and other events that were to take place in FY 2024. The tax, though, is due and is collected by the Department of Taxation and then remitted to the State General Fund, not when the event occurs, rather when the tickets are sold. And so because a lot of these events are tickets for events that are happening or have happened already in FY 2024 or actually sold in FY 2023, we ended up having to decrease our forecast in FY 2024 and essentially shift that revenue to FY 2023 because we just had the timing of when the tickets would be sold not precise. But in terms of the gap that we had, and we had a gap of $6.6 million, as you can see on that table. We work with the best information that we have when we forecast. And sometimes we get close and sometimes maybe not so much. And that's basically, I think, all I can say about that. Thank you.
Can I follow up? Yeah. So I know you're probably going to frown upon this question. But so did you over forecast what Formula One was going to bring in? Or did you, I mean, because there was a huge U2 concert at the Sphere. So, of course, I want to know about Formula One.
Madam Vice Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. I'm trying to get my bearings on the question. The answer, honestly, and I'll get more into it on agenda item 8, is we're really not sure yet in terms of Formula One. I know that there is at least one person at the Department of Taxation who is watching this meeting who is like, please don't give away any confidential information, and don't worry, I am not going to do that. We really can't talk about specific taxpayers, which makes it really difficult when we get into questions of what is the effect of Formula One to start talking about individual taxpayers or individual events, because it gets down to that confidentiality issue. But you do raise a valid point otherwise, is that Formula One is not the only event that is brand new that we are looking at. I mean, there is a Super Bowl that is happening at Allegiant Stadium here in a few weeks, and we will be collecting LET on that. The Sphere, the amount of tickets that are being sold for U2 shows there, and especially the prices that they are being sold at, is generating a fair amount of LET. And driving up and down Las Vegas Boulevard, if that is something that you do on a regular or an irregular basis, all of the shows and things that are there are going to generate revenue for the gaming side of the LET. If it's at T-Mobile or somewhere else, and as a concert, then it would generate the non-gaming LET. But there are all of these events, and these are things that we take into account when we do our forecast, speaking on behalf of the Fiscal Analysis Division. But things get announced and that we didn't take into our forecasts. And frankly, sometimes we look at something and we have assumptions and we have estimates, and they do better than we thought. And I think the Sphere is actually a good example of that, because we had some assumptions of what we thought it might do, and when we did forecasts, we had some idea of what the ticket prices might be, and we may have gotten the attendance or the ticket prices not correct in our forecast, or the frequency of the shows or things like that. So those are, again, all of the things that we have to take into account as forecasters for this process.
If the chair allows me to make an additional comment.
I was going to go just to you, Mr. Tower, for any further comments. Go ahead.
Thank you, Christian Tower, for the record. In addition to what Mr. Nakamoto explained, just want to explain briefly. If you go on page 89 of the meeting package, you see information on the non-gaming portion of the live entertainment tax. In fiscal year 2021, that tax was basically almost to zero in the pandemic. Then in fiscal year 2022, the revenues were about $39.8 million. In fiscal year 2023, that grew to $79.9 million. So this is a very significantly expanding tax. And as always, with a tax that is that dynamic, in its dynamic development, it's very difficult in general to get the forecast to the point right, because if you look at the entertainment situation in Las Vegas, we analyzed that and we knew the stadiums, and there were a lot of events planned and coming out. But some of these planned events were still subject to some uncertainty. So we had to make some assumptions on what we believed ticket prices would be, how many events we believed there would be really taking place, and in a situation where you do such a forecast of a massively expanding tax, I think all the forecasters were also aware that we didn't want to over-forecast this tax revenue, which could have the known consequence if we did so. So Yes, we did under forecast the tax a little bit, but I think for consideration here is also that this is really a very dynamic tax, which is naturally very difficult to project. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With that, we'll go ahead and move on to Assemblyman Orlichter.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this next presentation. So looking at the totals on 85 and 86, where you show us the different forecasts and how they compare with actual, it looks like when we went from December 2022 to May 2023, the forecast improved by about 2%, got about 2% closer, and you ended up maybe just under, a little under 1%. So fortunately, small differences. So I'm curious about how important that 2% improvement from December to May is. And is that a typical range change you see? And what's it, thinking about where you want to be, what's your goal? Is it good? Is 95% accuracy what everybody hopes for at least, or 98%? Is there like an accepted standard for this kind of forecasting where you want to be at a certain, at least at a, as I say, 95%, 98%?
Assemblyman Orlichter, Michael Nakamoto for the record. I don't know if you asked 100 forecasters or economists who do this, you might get 100 different answers of what their comfort level is. Obviously, we'd like to be as close to zero as possible. So the fact that and specifically looking at page 86, the bottom line, the total general fund revenue net of tax credits, that we went from 2.85% error in the December 2022 forecast to 0.76% for the May 2023. In my history with the Fiscal Analysis Division and being one of the forecasters for the Economic Forum, which I have been now for 18 years, that's probably not an unreasonable change for no other reason than keeping in mind that this is the current fiscal year. And so when we are sitting in December of 2022, right at that point, we're just receiving tax collections like sales tax for the first quarter, so through September. When we get to May, we've got additional months we'll have through the end of February. So we've got a few different months. We've got more history to look at. So we've got a better idea and are able to fine tune. And we're really only looking at forecasting the last 4 or 5 months of a lot of these revenue sources. So we have better information that we're working with. I am trying to think back, because one of the things that we do as part of the Economic Forum is kind of track the accuracy of the forecast, and it's a report that we put out and provide to the Economic Forum, and I can provide it to any of the members who would like to see that go through and compare all of the forecasts to all the actuals. And my recollection is for that current year forecast, the Economic Forum is good about getting it in that about 1% range. And for I guess the difference in this particular forecast, if we hadn't gotten at 1%, if we were at 1% the other direction, it might have meant that the legislature during the 2023 session had a little bit of less additional revenue for one-shot appropriations and things like that. But I mean, ideally, yes, 1%, it gives us, would we like a little bit more cushion than that? Certainly. But in terms of forecasting, I would say we did pretty well with that. Really having more money than that, basically we would just carry it forward into the next fiscal year. If we had less than that, it would be less that we carried forward. And that's the budget side of our office. So Mr. Thorley and Ms. Kaufman, the Assembly and Senate fiscal analysts, could address that a little bit more in terms of what that means in terms of the fund balance and all of that. But in terms of this particular forecast, I would say if you asked my opinion of where we would like to be, it's like, yes, as close to zero as possible. But I'd say if we're within 1 or 2%, and even on the negative side, if we're within 1%, that gives us a little, it's not optimal, obviously, but it's not something that we couldn't recover from, I don't think, in most situations.
Thank you so much. Do we have any additional questions from our members up in Carson City or online?
Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank our staff. I think getting within 1% is unbelievable given the amount of revenues that we have, and it takes a lot of work to be able to forecast and then to follow up as required when the Economic Forum meets to, put these tables together. So I'm just grateful for the work that they do, and I want to acknowledge them. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
If I may, I would also, to echo Senator Sievers-Ganser's comments, I'd like to thank the members of the Economic Forum as well. They are appointed by the governor. They're from the private sector, and they are volunteering their time and their knowledge and expertise to the state and to our forecasts. And they put in a lot of work and they ask thoughtful questions, and the meetings that we have are very insightful and deliberative, and I have thanked them before, but I want to thank them again, especially as their terms are now at the point of expiring, and we'll be impaneling a new economic forum for the next meeting, which is scheduled for early June. But I wanted to thank them as well.
Thank you so much to both Senator Sievers-Ganser and Mr. Nakamoto. I'd echo the sentiments that were stated for both the Economic Forum and also our fiscal staff, because I know you guys put in a lot of effort with this as well. With that, seeing no further questions, we can go ahead and move on to agenda item 8, which is a report and discussion of fiscal year 2024 year-to-date actual collections compared to the Economic Forum from May 1st, 2023 forecast, which is adjusted for legislative actions approved during the 2023 session, as well as our 34th and 35th special sessions. We already have Mr. Nakamoto up here ready to begin, so please free to start when you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, for the record, Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis Division. And the tables that I'm going through begin on page 99 of the packet. Those of you who either watched the Economic Forum meeting on December 5th or were present or watched the Interim Finance Committee meeting the following week have seen these tables before. This is the latest information that we have through the end of December. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it, but I will go through some of the tables and am able to answer any questions that you may have. So we'll start with Table 1 on page 99. And so this is comparing the 2023 actuals that Mr. Tower just went through in Agenda Item 7, as well as the 2024 forecast that I touched on in Agenda Item 6. And this is kind of putting those together. And so in the yellow column there, the FY 2023 actual, this is the information that Mr. Tower just went through in those previous tables. And then so you can see 3 columns there. The first is the actual dollar amount that was collected for that revenue source in the fiscal year. The second column, the FY actual percentage change, that is what that actual percentage was supposed to be. Or was based on comparing that number to what was actually collected for that revenue source in FY 2022. And then that third column, the Economic Forum May 2023 FY forecast percentage change, that's what the forecast for the Economic Forum was supposed to be. So if you look, for example, at the sales and use tax, that very first line, the actual percentage change was 6.7% based on those collections of $1.72 billion. The Economic Forum's forecast was of growth of 8.3%. And basically what that says is when that second column is larger than the first column, the actuals came in below the forecast. And if you wanted to go look at how much it was around $19.1 or $19.2 million. Those are in the previous agenda items. So similarly, if you look at the percentage fees tax, the next column, the $970.1 million, the actual percentage change was 0.6% compared to the Economic Forum's forecast percentage change of 0.1%. That means that the actuals came in above the forecast in this instance by the 0.5%. And so we go through all of that for all of these revenue sources. Under the major general fund revenues, those are the larger ones, obviously, the sales and use tax, the percentage fees tax, the insurance premium tax, the modified business tax, and you can see the three categories there for the general businesses, what we refer to as non-financial institutions, which is basically anybody who is not a financial institution or a mining company, and then, of course, the financial institutions and mining who are tracked separately. And then we have the live entertainment tax, the gaming and the non-gaming portions. The gaming portion is the portion, as I mentioned previously, administered by the Gaming Control Board, and the non-gaming portion administered by the Department of Taxation, the real property transfer tax, and then the commerce tax. And then under select non-major general fund revenues, we've got some of what we consider the major minor general fund revenues. So the transportation connection excise tax, which is commonly known as the Uber or Lyft tax, but it applies to taxi cabs and other common motor carriers. Then cigarette tax, the governmental services tax, which we have tracked on here, but you can see the forecast for FY24 is 0 based on the legislative actions from last session. The business license fee, which is predominantly collected by the Secretary of State's office, and then some of the other excise taxes, liquor and other tobacco, as well as the Secretary of State commercial filings and securities, and then the short-term car rental tax. And then those are added up. And then we have an all other general fund revenues, and I'll talk about that on a later table, which is basically everything else on those Economic Forum sheets that's not the specific revenues that are listed here. And then the commerce tax credits, and then the reductions for those tax credit programs that we've discussed before. So then the green column at the right is just basically what the percentage of the total general fund those make up, both for the actual collections in FY23 as well as the forecast for FY24. Sales tax, the state 2% sales tax is by far the largest portion of the state general fund, being 29.3% of the actual collections in FY23, and then followed by the gaming percentage fee, and then the MBT coming in third on that. So the next table is table 2, and this is the actual compared to forecast before tax credits for these same revenue sources. When we presented these tables, or when I presented these tables to the Interim Finance Committee, I noted that the actual and collections for FY23 and the forecast for FY24 for the insurance premium tax and the modified business tax were both set at 0, and we've remained with that. We have received a quarter of collections for the MBT and the insurance premium tax, but we're choosing to not report the actual compared to the forecast because of some reporting issues that happened in FY23. And so because those were going to be a significant distortion to the overall because of the reporting issues that happened last fiscal year, we chose to omit the comparison because basically what had happened is that there were a number of taxpayers who made a payment, but there was no associated tax return that went along with it. And so when that happens, the Department of Taxation basically holds the payment until they can get the tax return that is associated with it. So the collections in FY23 were short. And a lot of the collections were then reported in the second quarter. So Because we didn't have a similar situation happen in FY 2024, we would show all of this revenue that wasn't there in FY 23 in the first quarter, and it would show that these revenues are significantly outperforming where they actually are. So when we get to the second quarter and we are presenting these tables at the Economic Forum in June or to later meetings of this body, or to the Interim Finance Committee when that agenda item comes up, we'll have a comparison for the first 2 quarters that'll be a more apples-to-apples comparison, but for now, we're reporting those as 0 just to not distort it. But for the rest of the revenues, you can see the revenue source listed to the left in the same order that you saw them in agenda or in Table 1. And then there's a reference period in parentheses next to it, which represents the number of collections or number of collection periods, months or quarters as applicable for each of these revenue sources. So the sales and use tax numbers that we show here are for the first 4 months, so through October. The percentage fee tax is for the first 6 months, so that is actually through November. And then the live entertainment tax for the gaming portion is for the first 5 months through November. And the LET non-gaming is through 4 months through October. And the real property transfer tax is through the first quarter. And then you can see going further down below. So basically what on this page, the columns are the same. For the yellow column is the actual year to date. So it's through that first 4 months of FY23. And then the peach column to the right of that is the actual year to date through that same reference period in FY24. So looking at those, you can see that the collections for FY24 for the sales and use tax are up 3.6% compared to FY 2023. But then we get to the green column, and that's that first block that is the fiscal year-to-date forecast for FY 2024. And so basically what we're doing is we're taking that the growth rate of what the FY 24 forecast has to be compared to the FY 2023 actual, and we're applying that to each month or each reference period. So in this instance, based on where the sales and use tax ended at FY 2023, the fiscal year to meet the forecast, the sales and use tax for all of FY24 has to grow by 7.1%. So therefore each month or each portion of that reference period also has to grow by that same amount. And so that results in a fiscal year-to-date forecast of $607.6 million. So the end result is where we're at year-to-date, that $588 million based on this methodology is approximately $19.6 million or 3.2% below the forecast. And we go through that exercise with all of these revenue sources applying that same methodology. So for example, the gaming percentage fee is ahead of the forecast by approximately $25.8 million through the first 6 months. The live entertainment tax, total gaming and non-gaming, is above the forecast by approximately $27.8 million, primarily driven by the non-gaming portion, which is approximately $21.8 million above the forecast. The real property transfer tax is approximately $5 million below the forecast through the first quarter. And then the commerce tax, you can see there that the actual year-to-date collections are fairly low. This is a revenue source that generates just over $300 million per year for the state general fund, but the tax is not due until the end of the fiscal year. It's actually due around August 15th, is my recollection. And so the collections that we have are basically comparing the residual late payments that we received from FY23 that are credited to FY24 against the residual payments that were received in FY23 that were late collections for FY22. And that's approximately $5.7 million above the forecast. And so that's going to vary. So the total for these major general fund revenues, as you can see, is approximately $34.9 million, or approximately 2.9% above the forecast. one observation that I'll make on this is, yes, it's early in the fiscal year, and for some of these revenues, namely the sales and use tax, we're still waiting to see what November, the Formula One month, looks like. We'd also like to see what this current month, February, looks like with respect to the Super Bowl. We're not going to see that information from the Department of Taxation until the end of April. These numbers are always subject to change. For example, the live entertainment tax, because of that methodology we use, we are applying the growth rate for the forecast across all of the fiscal years. And we know, because of some of these special events that happened early in the fiscal year, that a lot of the collections that were built into the forecast for Formula One, Super Bowl, the Sphere, and so on, that's money that's been realized earlier in the fiscal year. And there may not be similar events. I mean, there will be things like Burning Man and other events that will go on sale, but the collections aren't, because they're not uniformly distributed across the fiscal year. It may mean that as we go further, that number may actually reduce depending on some of the activity that's going on, because a lot of these significant events that are driving the fiscal year forecast actually occur earlier in the year rather than later in the year. So down below, you can see the select non-major general fund revenues, and those are all not huge amounts. I mean, the transportation connection excise tax is approximately $1.2 million below the forecast. The business license fee is approximately $1.4 million below the forecast. But then the total of that is a reduction, or being short of the forecast by approximately $5.8 million for those. All other general fund revenues that you can see underneath that, the forecast for the fiscal year to date is approximately $102 million. Our collections are approximately $148.7 million. And we are approximately $46.7 million above the forecast. That is almost exclusively attributable to interest income, which is, based on our methodology, approximately $40 million above the forecast year to date. And so we're looking at that, and I think what I am attributing it to is, if we were to go back and look at the quarters for the interest income in FY23, they were fairly light in the first quarter because interest rates had not quite spiked to the levels that they had. And then I think the coronavirus money was still coming in around that point, but then they increased significantly in the last 3 quarters. So I would anticipate that those collections would, or that amount will even out as we get into those those last 3 quarters of the fiscal year, as with us comparing against some of those higher collections in FY23. And one of the other things that we are keeping our eyes on are the announcements that the Federal Reserve may make. The Open Markets Committee has signaled that they will potentially be reducing interest rates several times during this calendar year, which will most decidedly have an effect upon that particular revenue source, the interest income. So the total general fund revenues before tax credits are approximately $75.8 million above the forecast year to date, or approximately 5%. And again, for some of the reasons that I've indicated, there are some, it's not it wouldn't be a safe assumption to say, oh, we're $75 million above the forecast through a third of the fiscal year. We can multiply that by 3. We'll be $225 million above the at the end of the year. I would love to say that, but because of a lot of the variations in these tax credits, or in the tax revenues, how they're collected, some of the seasonal patterns, it is something that we continuously monitor. And there are some things that are giving us a little bit of pause, such as sales tax being 3.2% below the forecast. But there are some things that are in this. So there's a portion, for example, of the all other general fund revenues that are gaming penalties. Back in July, Steve Wynn was fined $10 million by the Gaming Control Board, which is picked up in revenue that is not, it's in our forecast for FY24 for the full fiscal year, but it's not necessarily realized in the year-to-date numbers just on how that is collected. So that's some of that money that will come off. So there are those little things, and it's all of these little pieces that kind of add up to get us to the totals here. But again, this is something that we keep our eyes on, and this is something, these are tables that are updated monthly, and at the pleasure of the chair, we can continue to add these particular tables as an agenda item to keep the committee informed of where the general fund is year to date.
That would be fantastic. I take it you're done with your presentation?
I'm done with table 2, and I figured this might be a good place to stop for questions if there are any, because I think the bulk of the questions are going to be on this table, but I will go through some of the other tables that are here at a very high level.
Okay, so we'll pause for questions. I did just have one quick clarification. It was just because I didn't hear correctly. When we were looking at table 2, the green columns, you had indicated one of the items was premised just on residual collections, late payments that were being considered and not actual revenue, and I just missed which category that was.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis Division. That was the commerce tax, the last item under the major general fund revenues. The tax is paid on a fiscal year basis, or a tax year basis, which coincides with the fiscal year. It's not due until the middle of August. So the money that we receive early in the fiscal year is usually late payments from the previous fiscal year.
And then I take it as we see time going forward, the commerce tax credits will also then get captured in the future time periods as well.
Madam Chair, that is correct. Michael Nakamoto for the record. If we actually had modified business tax in there, we would show the MBT or the commerce tax credits because those are a reduction against the MBT. But because the MBT we're currently showing as 0, we're showing the commerce tax credits as 0 also, just as the proper apples to apples comparison.
Thank you so much. And with that, do we have any other questions regarding these early tables? I'll turn it over to Senator Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So first question, it would be wise for us to maybe wait until May 2024 to decide whether or not we might have sufficient revenue or have to do some revenue raising measures, or would we wait until later in the year, like December?
Senator Neal, Michael Nakamoto for the record. In an ideal world, when we look at forecasting, we like to have as much information as we possibly can. I think we're year to date, we are holding our own for FY 2024. This is keeping in mind that a lot of the economic activity for which some of the forecasts were built has not occurred yet, or if it has occurred, we haven't seen information that relates to that. For example, sales tax collections from November, which the Department of Taxation will be releasing probably around this time next week, in which case we'll be able to update the tables, have sales tax through 5 months. We'll have another month of the percentage fees. We'll have another month of the live entertainment tax. And then a lot of these monthly collections will have additional information, and we would be able to, at the next meeting, give better information of where we're at through the end of January. As for when we would be a good time to assess where the state is, in terms of revenue, I don't know if I can necessarily answer that question as to a specific time frame. One of the things that, as your nonpartisan fiscal staff, that I will always remind legislators of are that there have been revenue actions and that there will be revenue actions that may not be keeping up necessarily with population and inflation, and we'll get into that in under agenda item 10, which is the last agenda item that I will be presenting. But also one of the big ones that is definitely on our radar is that interest income that the chair had mentioned or asked the question, and it is a factor not only of current interest rates being so high, but also because a significant amount of the money that we are holding on to and earning interest on is federal coronavirus money that has to be obligated by the end of this calendar year and the end of calendar year 26. So when the Economic Forum meets, and I'm not wanting to signal any forecasts that our office or any of the forecasters may be doing, but when we get to table 7 on this agenda item, I will point out kind of where actual collections were for interest income in previous fiscal years compared to where they are for FY23, and then the forecast for 24 and 25. And I think you can put together where I'm going, given the conditions that we are expecting for that particular revenue source. And I'll talk more about that when we get to that.
Okay, Madam Chair, can I ask one more question, different topic? So in the TNCs, did you forecast the effect of the geofencing of that particular, well, there were several state impacted revenues from the stadium bill, because in the stadium bill for the Oakland A's, they were going to geofence the TNC revenue and keep it for themselves. So we're going to see, whenever the stadium manifests, a drop in some revenues that were coming to the state, but particularly that geofencing language was very interesting and special because they didn't necessarily clearly have a boundary, because they said, you know, the ingress and the egress, so coming in and coming out, was all geofenced to go to the stadium.
Senator Neal, Michael Nakamoto for the record, and that is a very good question. And the quick answer that I will tell you is no, we have not done any analysis on that. And part of the thing that we are waiting on is, I think, to determine what that boundary would be. And then we would have to make some assumptions on what that necessarily means in terms of the ingress and the egress from that from that location, whatever the boundaries of the location may be, because you're correct, having the boundary may make a difference, whether it's right at the sidewalk, is it across the street, is it right in the middle of the street, is it some area that is within walking distance. Those are the questions that we would have to ask, and what that necessarily means. But it's something that we have kind of kept in the back of our minds as a potential revenue effect on the state general fund as a result of the passage of SB 1.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It may be something in the future in 25, and I don't know when the stadium is going to manifest, but I think it is a lesson for us to be more prescriptive when those kinds of geofencing language pops up, and then also a lesson for the future to not let the stadium authority to plan those boundaries, but for us to give them those boundaries so we can protect our own revenue streams.
Thank you, Senator Neal. Anyone else, any other members have any questions regarding these first few tables? With that, I will turn it back over to Mr. Nakamoto, and I believe we're on page 101.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Again, for the record, Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis Division. I promised I would go through the rest of the tables very quickly, and I will, at least for tables 3 through 6. I might spend a little more time on table 7, given Senator Neal's previous question. Table 3 basically is a comparison of the actual remainder of the fiscal year collections, that is, what was collected during the end of FY23 after the reference period, compared to the forecast for the remainder of the fiscal year from the current reference period all the way to the end of the fiscal year. And then it shows what the growth rate has to be to actually meet the forecast. So right now, the actual percentage change for the sales and use tax for the last 8 months was 5.2% growth compared to the last 8 months of FY22. To meet the forecast of $1.7 billion, we would have to collect $1.255 billion in the last 8 months of FY24, which is an 8.8% increase in that tax. And then that goes through basically and shows for all of them. And basically the end result is the total general fund revenues before tax credits, for the rest of the fiscal year, we can actually be down by 3.4% compared to the forecast. And that's for everything with the exception of the MBT and the MBT and the insurance premium tax, which we're still reporting as zeros. So under table 4, and basically table 4 is the same as table 2, but it is supposed to be after tax credits. And so what we do with this is, because the forecast that the Economic Forum does for a lot of the tax credits that apply to multiple tax sources, such as the film tax credits, we don't, or the Economic Forum does not forecast those, and we do not present forecasts for those for those tax credits for each individual revenue source. We just have it as an aggregate. The only ones where there's like a specific forecast against a specific revenue source or the commerce tax credits against the MBT, as well as things like the college savings plan, the education choice, which are against the MBT, and the new markets jobs credits, which are against the insurance premium tax. But for the rest of them, we do an aggregate of the entire bucket and not for the individual pieces. So what we do with table 4 for all of the meetings that aren't the end of the fiscal year is we basically force the actuals to balance to the forecasts for table 2. So the numbers are the bottom line for table 4 and table 5, which I'll get to, are largely the same, but we are forcing them to balance, so then the end result is the same. And you can specifically see that on table 5, where the one tax type that has tax credits attached to it right now is the percentage fees tax. We are basically saying that the dollar difference is that $25.8 million above the forecast. We're not factoring the tax credits into it for the time being. Those numbers are identical. So you can see the bottom line, the end result is the same, that after tax credits on this, we're approximately $75.8 million above the forecast. These tables have more meaning when we get to the end of the fiscal year, because then we can actually see what the general fund looked like before and after tax credits, but it's hard for us to do that in the period between then. Table 6 is on page 104 and 105, and that actually goes through the individual revenue sources and shows which tax credits were used against those tax types. So on page 104, this is all the MBT, and we're showing zeros on this for FY23 and FY24 year to date to keep in line with us not reporting any MBT actual collections for the first quarter. And then on page 105, the only year-to-date credits that you can see that have actually been taken are in the first block for the percentage fees, where there's been some amount of film tax credits that have been used against that. And then again, with the insurance premium tax, we're showing those as zeros because we're showing the revenues as zeros. So this is a tax that, or a set of tables that becomes more meaningful as we go through the fiscal year, so we can see how the credits are actually being used by credit type, by revenue source. But for now, we're really only showing the film tax credits on this. And so finally, there are some footnotes that are largely identical to some of the footnotes on some of the other pages, including some notes on the tax credits. But I do want to spend some time on Table 7. And Table 7 basically takes the year-to-date collections for the entire general fund. So it's all the majors, all of the minor revenues, everything that's on the economic forum sheets, and compares it to the previous fiscal year. So it's through December 31st of FY23, so December 31st, 2022, to the end of December of FY24, which is December 31st of 2023. And so the one thing that I will show on this, and it's kind of as a follow-up to Senator Neal's question on the interest, or on the things to consider for our revenue going forward, is on page 115, and it's the treasurer's interest income again, GL 3290. So you can see through the first quarter, or through December 31st of 2022, so it's really the first quarter of FY23, interest was $11.9 million for the quarter. Interest for the second quarter of, for the first quarter of FY24, so through December of 2023, we were at $54.3 million. And that's that combination of the high investable balance as well as the increased interest rates that we've been experiencing. And so the actual collections for FY23, as you can see in the column to the left of the yellow column, were $142.6 million. And that, again, was that combination of interest rates and the large investable balance due to the influx of federal money that may have been obligated or might not have been obligated, but it has not been spent yet. And so the forecast that we have for FY 2024, going back to the agenda item 6 tables for the Economic Forum, was $170 million. For FY24. And if that $54.6 million or $54.3 million continued, we would be above that forecast. And then we have it coming down to FY25 as approximately $150 million, which, as that investable balance gets spent down and as interest rates reduce, is something that is not surprising to us, and we believe that that will occur. But what is interesting to note on Table 7 is we show the history going back to FY 2020, back when there was not a lot of federal money sitting in our coffers and back when interest rates were a lot lower. So you can see in FY 2022, we were at $24.2 million. In FY21 was $8.8 million, but that, I think, was a lot of pandemic effects there because revenues were short and interest rates were really low. But FY 2020 was around $20 million. And if I were to go back and look through the history, more often than not, we're in that range of $20 to $30 million. There were some points back before the Great Recession, so FY 2007, 2008, where that total might have been around $50 million. Which is a far cry from $150 or $170 million. So I think one of the things that as forecasters we're cautious of, and something just as some thoughts for this body as well for the legislature going forward, is that if this trend were to continue and we start looking, even if the forecasts for FY 2026, FY 2027 were to get down to around the $50 million a year, that's $100 million a year of revenue or more that you had during this biennium that you will not have in the next biennium. And $100 million a year is getting close to 2%. So if we were to say, just if I'm throwing a number out of the air, that the ideal for the state general fund for the next biennium is to have 5% growth. If the treasurer's interest income does not come in the way that it has for the last couple of years, and that it is expected to for this biennium, your 5% is looking at being closer to 7%. So that's not advocating to necessarily do anything about that. In terms of your nonpartisan staff, we're not going to give you recommendations of how to fix that or things that you can do, but it's just as forecasters and as your staff that monitors the general fund, those are things that we keep our eyes on and we keep kind of as consideration, especially as you're looking at building budgets and forecasting revenue for the next biennium. So with that, Madam Chair, on that rosy, upbeat note, I will stand for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nakamoto, for the remainder of the presentation under this agenda item. Members, do we have any questions regarding these last tables? I don't see any questions. So with that, we can move along to agenda item 9. And I believe we have our fiscal staff, Ms. Powers, presenting up there in Carson City. And so when she's ready to begin, please feel free to start.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Susanna Powers with the Fiscal Analysis Division. In this agenda item, we have a presentation on trends in personal income and wages in relation to population, employment, and inflation on a national level and in Nevada. This presentation starts on page 121 of your meeting packet. Let's start on page 122. So on this page, there is a chart that shows the U.S. employment level from the year 2000 until the third quarter of 2023. This chart shows the magnitude of the impact that the 3 recessions had on the U.S. employment level during this time interval. The one in 2001, often referred as the dot-com recession, was relatively short and shallow. The one in the late 2000s was the Great Recession, and it was severe, and recovery from it was lengthy. 4 years ago, the U.S. economy was in its longest expansion on record before ending suddenly in the spring of 2020, when the economy fell into a recession that was triggered by the pandemic. Fast forward to the third quarter of 2023, the U.S. total employment level is about 4.7 million jobs above the pre-pandemic peak. While we have seen a robust recovery in many economic metrics, there are still some lingering adverse effects that were triggered by the pandemic, some of which are shown later in this presentation. The focus of this presentation is looking at the economic recovery from the pandemic, as it particularly relates to income and wages. The next page has a chart that shows employment in Nevada. Note that this presentation was prepared in the early part of last week. At that time, the last full quarter of employment data was available only through the third quarter. So through the third quarter of 2023, the Nevada total employment is about 119,000 jobs above the pre-pandemic peak. The jobs recovery from the pandemic was not as fast as it was from the 2001 recession, but it has been much, much faster than the one from the Great Recession. Page 124 shows the leisure and hospitality sector employment in Nevada. This is particular interest to us because Nevada was one of the hardest hit states by the pandemic, largely due to the sizable role tourism and hospitality industries play in our economy. While many industry sectors recovered rather quickly, payrolls in the leisure and hospitality sector reached the pre-pandemic peak level just recently, and through the third quarter, there are 5,400 more jobs compared to the pre-pandemic peak. Page 125 shows a comparison of employment growth rates between the U.S. and Nevada since 2001. One takeaway from this chart is that Nevada's job growth is typically higher than the national average, except during economic downturns. As you can see by the blue line for Nevada, it has typically hovered above the red line for the U.S., except during the severe economic downturns. When measuring the employment growth since the start of the pandemic through the third quarter, Nevada's employment has recovered slightly better than that of the U.S. On average, the job growth for the U.S. has been 0.9%, while Nevada's has been 2.8%. Page 126 displays the population growth rates for the U.S. and Nevada, and I'm bringing this in relation to looking at population trends over the last 2 decades. The national population growth is historically low, but has returned to pre-pandemic trend. In recent history, Nevada has experienced one of the most favorable population trends in the nation, migration being the primary driver, and has often been ranked among the top 10 fastest growing states. While Nevada's population is growing, the growth has slowed down based on Census Bureau data. Page 127 shows the Consumer Price Index, CPI, our headline inflation indicator, and selected components for the CPI. The red line represents the CPI for all items. The green line represents the CPI for food. The purple line represents the CPI for energy, which is one of the most volatile components. And the blue line represents the core CPI, which covers all items less food and energy. The next 2 slides get more in detail into the pieces that have been driving the inflation rate. Page 128 shows how inflation is one of the lingering effects of the pandemic on the economy. While inflation has been trending down from the peak of 8.6% reached in mid-2022, it remains elevated at 3.2% year over year at the end of last year. Based on the core CPI measure, after removing the energy and food components, we have a 4% inflation rate compared to a year ago. Page 129 shows how the energy component, shown by the purple line, has been the largest contributor to change in the CPI. We have seen relief on this front. In the last quarter of 2023, the energy prices are down by 4% compared to the same quarter in the previous year. The food component of the CPI, represented by the green line, is up by 3% in this time period. Page 130 shows the pieces and their respective shares. Okay, hold on. I think we just finished the CPI. So now we're moving on to personal income components. So we're on page 130, and page 130 shows the pieces and their respective shares of the total personal income for the U.S. through the third quarter of last year, which is the latest available quarter available from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Total personal income is comprised of wages and salaries, dividends, interest, and rent, transfer payments, supplements to wages and salaries, and proprietors' income. The largest share of personal income is wages and salaries, that is represented by the red line. Typically, this share is about 50% of all personal income. The shape of the letter W that formed in that red line during the pandemic period is the result of lost wages and salaries. Government transfers in the form of money income and in-kind benefits accounted for about 17% of total personal income prior to the pandemic response by the federal government, a line represented by the blue line. This share is now at around 18%. A big A big takeaway from this slide is the magnitude of the role the government transfer payments played in 2020 and 2021 in response to the lost wages and salaries due to the pandemic. On page 131, it shows that Nevada's story for personal income components is similar to the previous nationwide slide, except that the drop in the share of wages and salaries as a percent of total personal income was larger than that for the U.S., and the increase in the share of transfer payments as a percent of total personal income in 2020 and 2021 was more pronounced than what they were for the U.S. Page 132 shifts to U.S. total personal income and total wages and salaries. Personal income in a red line shows the two spikes coinciding with the federal stimulus and other programs in 2020 and 2021. As a result, we do not see the typical peak to trough and recovery pattern associated with economic downturns. It looks more like a peak to peak and back to trend line. When compared to 2020 Q1, which was the last period before the pandemic started, personal income is up by 22.8%. The wages and salaries illustrated by the black line show a more typical pattern of the last peak, then trough, and subsequent recovery. When compared to the pre-pandemic peak, wages and salaries are up by 23.6%. The next page shows that for the Nevada total personal income and total wages and salaries, the narrative is very similar. When compared to the pre-pandemic peak, personal income is up by 27.3% and wages and salaries are up by 28.4%. Page 134 shows the growth rates for personal income comparing Nevada to the U.S. Since the onset of the pandemic in the second quarter of 2020, Nevada's personal income growth averages 7.2% compared to the 6.1% for the U.S. Page 135 shows a comparison of the growth rates for wages and salaries between Nevada and the U.S. We can see that during normal times, Nevada's wage and salary growth rate tends to outpace that of the U.S. When looking at the recent shocks to the economic system, the magnitude of the decline in wage and salary growth are deeper for Nevada than for the U.S. Since the onset of the pandemic, Nevada has outpaced the U.S. with a growth rate of 8.3% compared to 6.3% for the U.S. Page 136 brings in the population component and shifts to per capita personal income for the U.S. Compared to the quarter preceding the start of the pandemic, per capita personal income is up by 21.4%. However, when adjusted for inflation, the growth rate is lower and up by 2.6% during that period. Turning to page 137. In nominal terms, Nevada per capita personal income is up by 23.5% since the first quarter of 2020. When adjusted for inflation, it is up by 4.4% since that period. Page 138 shows a side-by-side comparison of per capita personal income for the U.S. and Nevada. Nevada's per capita personal income is trending below that of the U.S., but the nominal percent change in per capita personal income compared to the quarter preceding the start of the pandemic is slightly higher in Nevada than in the U.S. as a whole. Page 139 shows a side-by-side comparison of inflation-adjusted per capita personal income for the U.S. and Nevada. on an inflation-adjusted basis, Nevada's per capita personal income is also trending below that of the U.S., but the percent change in per capita personal income compared to the quarter preceding the start of the pandemic is slightly higher in Nevada than in the U.S. as a whole. Then on page 140, we have U.S. versus Nevada per capita personal income growth comparison. Since the onset of the pandemic, Nevada has performed slightly better than the U.S. For the last 3 years, the U.S. Per capita personal income growth has averaged 5.8% compared to 6.3% for Nevada. Page 141 shows when inflation adjusted, the per capita personal income growth is only 1.1% for the U.S. and 1.5% for Nevada. Page 142 shifts to wages and salaries on per employee basis for the U.S. When the pandemic hit, there was a large decline in lower wage jobs, leading to a somewhat sharp increase in wages and salaries per employee seen in the data that corresponds with the year 2020. This is because the cost of the pandemic-induced recession was disproportionately borne by lower wage workers as they experienced a bigger share of job and wage losses than those with higher incomes. As employment has recovered, we have seen a robust growth in employee wages and salaries. When comparing to the quarter that preceded the start of the pandemic, wages and salaries per employee are up by 19.9%. Yet, when adjusted for inflation, wages and salaries are up only by 1.4% during that period. On page 143, we can see that same pattern of a sudden upward movement in wages and salaries per employee in Nevada in response to large losses of jobs associated with lower wage sectors such as leisure and hospitality. In nominal terms, Nevada wages and salaries per employee are up by 18.6% since the first quarter of 2020. However, when adjusted for the effects of inflation, wages and salaries on a per employee basis are up by 0.3% for that period. Page 144 shows a side-by-side comparison of wages and salaries per employee in nominal terms for the U.S. and Nevada. It is interesting to note that the widened gap between the U.S. and Nevada that occurred after the Great Recession has never narrowed. Page 145 shows a side-by-side comparison of wages and salaries per employee on inflation-adjusted terms from quarter 1 2020 to quarter 3 2023 for the U.S. and Nevada. On an inflation-adjusted basis, the percent change in per employee wages and salaries in Nevada since the pre-pandemic peak is almost flat. Turn to page 146. In terms of wages and salaries per employee growth rates, Nevada is very comparable to the U.S. If you look at the last 3 years, the U.S. has averaged a growth rate of 5.4% compared to 5.5% for Nevada. Page 147 shows that on an inflation-adjusted basis, wages and salaries per employee grew only by 0.7% for the U.S. and by 0.8% for Nevada. We're going to now switch to, on page 148, to median household income. We're going to compare the U.S. and Nevada for the years between 2000 and 2022. There is no update for 2023 yet available. Prior to the Great Recession, Nevada's median household income exceeded that of the U.S., but it has remained below the US since. This trend was briefly reversed in 2019, but it fell again below the US at the onset of the pandemic. Between 2019 and 2022, the median household income rose by 8.6% for the US and by 2% for Nevada. Moving on to the next slide. Yet when we adjust for inflation, the US median household income fell by 5.2% between 2019 and 2022. The Nevada median household income declined by 10.9%. Page 150 summarizes the page 148 slide, so 2 slides ago for the US versus Nevada comparison in terms of nominal growth rates. So it just repeats the same percentages, but the graph looks different. And then the page 151 does another summary that you just saw in terms of the growth rate comparisons. This was information that you already saw on page 149. Then I'm going to move on to page 152. This page shows Nevada general fund revenue divided by the personal income of Nevada residents in thousands of dollars. This chart is sensitive to the economic cycles and the effects of tax changes. If this blue line is moving up, then the general fund is growing faster than personal income. If the blue line is moving down, then the personal income is rising faster than the general fund. Nevada witnessed a decline in fiscal 2020 due to the pandemic. We had a slight rebound in fiscal 2021 that was followed by a robust increase in fiscal 2022 and then followed by another slight increase in fiscal year 23. The last page of my presentation shows the general fund and personal income growth rates and how they have performed over time. So we have 2 separate series here. The first observation is that the trend between the 2 series tend to move together. The state's general fund receives a large portion of revenue from sources that are supported by personal income. The second observation is that while our state had a record growth in tax revenue collections in fiscal 2022 compared with the pre-pandemic growth trends, that peak in the general fund growth rate represented by the blue line did not surpass the peak of fiscal year 2004 that followed the 2003 legislative session when major changes were made to taxes. Mr. Nakamoto will talk more about the general fund in our next presentation. So this does conclude my part. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Ms. Powers, for your presentation. I will start off questions, and I'm looking at the chart on page 148, and this is the U.S. versus Nevada median household income from 2000 to 2022. And what I would anticipate those that weren't actively looking to regain employment would be excluded. But I was curious if you had knowledge whether or not that was true when we're looking at the post-pandemic rebound, kind of showing that the household income kind of wasn't jumping back to where it was, if that did take into consideration or did not take into consideration those that decided not to return to the workforce.
Madam Chair, for the record, Susanna Powers. Thank you for the question. So this particular slide that we're looking at on page 148 is survey-based data that comes with some lag from Census Bureau. So it surveys households and asks questions about their incomes. And the data here shows the median household income for the U.S. on average versus Nevada. So it is a little bit lagged. I wasn't quite following if it doesn't measure workforce participation. So this looks at a survey of households and so it's not a complete count. It's a survey-based data, and asks what their income was in a particular either month or year, depending on what the survey is being used for. I believe it's a monthly survey. So, if Madam Chair, you could maybe clarify the question.
You actually answered my question indirectly, is if it is a survey of the household median income, if one of two people did not return to the workforce, then they would be reporting their surveyed income that could be less than what it was before had they returned. So it doesn't offset it doesn't take into consideration whether someone's like actively looking for employment when we're seeing other charts. So I appreciate your response because you did answer what I was kind of curious about. With that, do we have any other members that have any questions? I'll go ahead and turn it over to Senator Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So thank you for your presentation. I always love seeing the, the broad economic strokes. So in your opinion, do you think this increase in wages in Nevada buffered our population from the loss of the transfer payments? I mean, I know inflation is eating up the money, so, but did at least the movement in the wages buffer them from the loss of those payments?
Vice Chair Neal, for the record, Susanna Powers, thank you for the question. So there were lost wages due to the various shutdowns we had in Nevada or nationwide. However, there were several federal government programs that kind of stepped in and supplemented the lost wages. At times, there were even greater amounts than what a typical paycheck was for an average worker, not necessarily every time, but anecdotally. Remember seeing that. So if Vice Chair Neal could clarify the question, I'm not sure if I'm answering it quite correctly.
So, I'll clarify. So on each chart, it shows that we have had some wage growth, meaning in the way I'm interpreting it, and I saw this anecdotally, that corporations, even, small retail, increased their wages in order to lure workers in because there literally was a drop-off. But did these increases where we went from $12 to $15 an hour, do you believe that for the transfer payments that came from the government, the federal government, do you think that offset, I guess, the income of our residents, or do you think that some of our residents are still attempting to rebound because they had got a government stimulus check that basically was more than their paycheck, and now even though they had a wage growth, we still maybe need to do some movement there and try to figure out if our citizens need to make more money just to keep ahead? I guess it's the simplest way of me trying to break that down.
Vice Chair Neal, for the record, for the record, Susanna Powers, thank you for the question. I think it's a little bit of potentially both, and maybe also some other factors not even being considered here. And so it's really difficult to answer that question without having data to look at. So we can attempt to see if we have any data that we can take a look at and answer that question and get back to you, unless Mr. Nakamoto might have a better answer to this excellent question.
Senator Neal, Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. Whether I have a better question or answers the question or not is debatable. But I think what a lot of the charts that Ms. Powers just presented show is that obviously the pandemic had a drastic effect on the economy for a significant portion of the workforce here in the state. And as she alluded to in a number of the slides, it was primarily lower wage workers who were affected probably more significantly than higher wage workers because of the shutdowns, the hotels and casinos and restaurants and things like that were forced to close their doors or severely curtail their business activities during the period of the pandemic. And so as a result of that, and I think I would agree with Ms. Powers' assessment that there were instances where a lot of the transfer payments that were received from the state and the federal government, unemployment benefits, stimulus payments from the federal government, and so on, actually were higher than the wages that were paid. But I think it was there were a number of factors that kind of came into play after that, and the increases in inflation and wages increasing. And I think the point that you raised, Senator Neal, about how there are a number of businesses who had to significantly increase their wages in order to attract workers to come back for whatever reason, whether it was because they were suddenly making more money or had been making more money in with the transfer payments, or it was just simply wage demand. You needed to get people back to work, and the businesses were willing to pay that and are continuing to be willing to pay that amount. And so all of these factors, I think, are coming in. Does that necessarily mean, I think, getting to your question of whether everything is okay? I am sure that you could go ask 100 people if they're doing better than they were during the pandemic, and you'll find a lot of people who are saying no. But I think on average what those charts are showing is that wages have held up fairly well to inflation in the post-pandemic world. And with the associated price increases and tax collections and things like that show for that, and I'll go through that in agenda item 10. But yeah, I think you're asking a very good question that probably doesn't have as simple an answer as we could give you, other than maybe.
And thank you for that, Mr. Nakamoto. I know this is all theoretical, but it just begs the question, because we started off with the NCSL presentation saying we have given more tax abatements or credits or exemptions to corporations, which in theory means that we're helping them to maintain a profit. And then on the other end, our citizens are roughly saying, I'm not sure I have enough making enough money to take care of myself. But we also know that inflation is eating the wage increase that we gave them, right? So we're hoping that the Federal Reserve tries to give some relief so that this inflation that is literally killing any increase will give them some relief so we can really determine what is an effective solution, right? Because in crisis, what we do, we either target the corporation or our people target us because they're saying, I don't have enough to take care of myself, right? They're not looking at these economic tables to try to, get an answer for their life. They're looking for government to give them a solution and say, increase minimum wage. And then we're trying to figure out what's the appropriate behavior and appropriate treatment of businesses and everything else. And so I think it's a good conversation. Hopefully we'll have, continue to try to see some data over the summer so that we can really, I think, make determination on what's good policy for our state and try to help our folks in multiple ways, stay housed, be able to pay for health care and all these different things that they're telling us they can't do, even though wages grew.
With that, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Assemblywoman Considine.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions. One of them is when we're talking about the income and the wages, for the rental assistance for Nevada, was that considered as income?
Assemblywoman Considine, for the record, this is Susanna Powers. That is an excellent question. The personal income includes transfer payments. As long as rental assistance is considered a transfer payments, a part of transfer payments, that would be included, but I do not have the exact definition handy, so we would have to actually double check that. But transfer payments are included in personal income. So as long as that particular item is listed in that definition, it would be included. But that is something we can definitely get back to you on.
Thank you. I would appreciate that information.
And as a follow-up to that, Madam Chair, Assemblywoman Considine, this is Michael Nakamoto for the record. Transfer payments, just as a broad definition, is it's a payment from the government to an individual where there is not anything expected in return. So we think commonly of things like Social Security as a transfer payment, but unemployment payments, and then like the federal stimulus that was given out during the pandemic is part of the reason why those there were those significant spikes, in addition to the additional the unemployment or the unemployment benefits that were paid out. With respect to rental assistance, if it came from the government, I would tend to believe that it would fall under that definition of transfer payment. But again, as Ms. Powers indicated, that is something that we would have to double check on just to confirm that we are correct or not on that.
Thank you. I would appreciate that information, specifically because a lot of those payments went to landlords. So if we're talking about people who got the ability to stay in their rental because of rental payments, would that go considered as landlord income, or would that be considered as tenant income? And if so, how does that work in here, in these graphs? So if, yeah, any kind of response later, I understand. Thank you. And then my second question was, on page 124, the graph on the Nevada Leisure and Hospitality employment, I know it shows that there's 5,400 jobs, an increase of 5,400 jobs. Is this any consideration of the number of jobs that are available, let's say pre-pandemic, plus the additional resorts, or is this just jobs? There's no real comparison with whether or not there are lesser jobs in hospitality and leisure. It's just, this is more people in jobs, not counting how many used to be available. Does that make sense?
Assemblywoman Considine, for the record, Susanna Powers, thank you for that question. So on page 124, it shows Nevada Leisure and Hospitality employment. So it looks at the number of jobs in that text box that existed in this wide sector that includes accommodations, such as casino employment, food establishments, bars, and namely the biggest ones. And so it looks at what that level was before the pandemic and then where we are in the most recent quarter. And that difference is that there is now additional 5,400 jobs. Would that answer the question?
Thank you for the answer. When you're saying there's 5,400 more jobs, is that 5,400 more positions or just more people that are working? I guess what I'm trying to figure out is it possible that there is a net loss or balance of jobs because more resorts have opened or more leisure hospitality entities have opened, but there are less positions?
Thank you for that follow-up question, Assemblywoman Considine. This particular employment data, it tracks the jobs, not people. There are some other employment series that will display data that is based on a worker. But this particular chart shows data based on jobs. And there could be multiple job holders in this data, so it doesn't make distinction if somebody has 2 part-time jobs, if they were counted in that data during a survey period, they might be working multiple jobs, maybe in 2 different casinos, for instance. Would that answer that question?
Yes, thank you very much.
If I may, Madam Chair, just Michael Nakamoto for the record, just kind of as a follow-up or just some additional information for your consideration, Assemblywoman Considine. One of the things that has been relayed to us by various individuals who monitor the gaming industry and the employment in the gaming industry is that in a lot of instances, because of the pandemic, it kind of forced a lot of these establishments to operate differently. And in some instances, it was more efficiently. So whether it was a question of housekeepers not making up rooms every day, fewer slot machines on the floor, fewer wait staff within restaurants and things like that. Those are some of the reasons perhaps why the industry plummeted the way that it did, and then did not come back nearly as quickly as it plummeted because a lot of the establishments found different ways to operate. And as time has progressed, I think demand has necessitated that a lot of these businesses bring back more and more staff. But I think and then certain decisions that have been made, such as bringing back daily housekeeping and things like that, have also factored into this. But I think if you were to start looking at individual details, you might see some instances where the gaming industry has made some operational decisions that have perhaps not necessitated them bringing back as many jobs as they otherwise would have. So even though since the pandemic you've had Resorts World, Fontainebleau, some of these larger gaming establishments open up, and that have certainly started employing additional persons. As Ms. Powers noted, it may be people who are holding multiple jobs, but then we'd have to look at the worker counts as opposed to the employment. But it may also be a case that they are bringing on fewer workers than perhaps they might have before the pandemic, just because the operational needs or the way that they're operating has changed just a little bit.
Thank you so much. Do we have anyone up north that may have any questions for either Ms. Powers or Mr. Nakamoto regarding agenda item 9? With that, I think we are ready to move on to agenda item number 10. And I believe we already have Mr. Nakamoto ready to go. So please feel free to start when you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. Again, for the record, Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis Division. Agenda item 10 is a series of one table and several charts that go through the State General Fund. And it's kind of a extension a little bit from some of the information that Ms. Powers just went through in terms of looking at inflation and population. And basically, specifically, this is looking at how inflation and population have affected the State General Fund. This is a series of a table and a series of charts that we put together and presented at the last the first meeting of the last interim committee at the request of the vice chair. And so we have updated that and are providing this information to the members of the committee today. So on page 155 is table 1. And this is basically looking at the actual and forecasted state general fund revenue, and this is for the entire unrestricted state general fund. And then when you start looking at population and inflation. And so the way that we have set this up is we have the actuals through from FY 1990 all the way through FY 2023, and then the Economic Forum's May 1st forecast adjusted for legislative actions for FY 24 and FY 25. And we're showing that in millions of dollars in that first column along with the percent change. And so, I mean, at face value, you can say, okay, the state general fund now is 7 times greater than it was in 1990, and that's all well and good, but the population of the state is greater and inflation plays a role, because the dollar of tax revenue that was generated in FY 1990 doesn't have the same purchasing power for the state agency who is expending that revenue for any number of reasons, wages, cost of goods, and so on, right now in FY 2024. Likewise, the demographic that is being served by the state, the population of the state has nearly tripled in that period. So, for example, we'll look at FY 1990, where actual general fund revenues were approximately $802 million, but the statewide population was 1.2 million. We have, for the inflation adjustment, we have to set a reference point. There's no other reason to set FY 1990 as the reference point, except for the fact that it's the beginning of the series. So the consumer price index, we set it at 1, and that's just the index. So everything is in reference to FY 90 for this particular table. So when you put all of those things together, you can see that the inflation-adjusted dollars per capita for the state general fund was $648.80, and that's per person in those inflation-adjusted dollars that are indexed back to 1990. And so we go through all of this entire series, and you can see the population changes and the inflation changes. And so the population comes from the state demographer, who's required to certify the state's population every year. The consumer price index is measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics when we get down through the actual period. When we get to the forecast period, the population is the demographer's 20-year projections that they do every October. The consumer price index forecasts are from Moody's Analytics, who we use to receive forecast data from when we do our own forecasts. And so you can see when you get down to FY 2023, the actual general fund revenues that are inflation adjusted per person are $746.10, which again is higher than it was in FY 1990. But then in FY 24 and 25, based on the population and inflation forecasts, you can see that amount decreasing down to $695.10. Inflation adjusted per person for the FY 2025 forecast. So the end result of this table is we put together some statistics that over the life of this period, so for this 35 fiscal years, the average growth in the state general fund before inflation was 6.5%. But then when you factor in population and inflation, you get all the way to the right-hand side. That average for FY 1990 to FY 2025 is only 0.6% per year. So in terms of the state general fund, it's something that is held up fairly well to inflation and population, but there are periods where it's been better than others. But that's one of the things in terms of the productivity of the general fund is one of the things that we keep an eye on, not just those dollar amounts, but what it actually means in terms of providing services and the purchasing power of the revenue that the state receives. On page 156 is basically taking all of that information that was in the previous table and making pretty lines out of it. So you can see there's a red line down in there that's the population growth. The purple line is inflation. But to make it easier, we created a green line, which is the sum of that, the population and inflation. And then the blue line is the general fund revenue that was collected for each fiscal year. And so for every fiscal year where that blue line is above the green line, that means that the general fund growth rate is outpacing population and inflation. But for every year where the green line is higher than the population and inflation are outpacing the state general fund. So that's kind of been a mixed bag. And as we get into some of these further charts, there's some reasons why that's kind of flipped back and forth between the general fund outpacing population and inflation or vice versa. So on page 157, chart 2, this is basically isolating out the general fund revenue portion of it. So the green line with the red line at the end, that's the current dollars, that's the actual dollars that were generated from the state general fund. And then the purple line below that with kind of the trailing tan or orange line is the inflation, taking those dollars and inflation, adjusting it back to FY90. So they start at the same point, but you can see that one of them is growing faster than the other one being the inflation-adjusted dollars. So just taking inflation into account, you can see that the general fund is still growing at various points. But one of the things that you can note on this chart that you'll actually note in a lot of the charts that I'm going to go through here is you can see that there are parts where it kind of goes along and then bumps up and then maybe falls off a little bit and then bumps up again. So for example, in FY 2003, you can see it's growing at a fairly flat. I mean, there's a slight increase to it, but from FY 2003 to FY 2004, there's a big jump, and both in the current dollars and the inflation-adjusted dollars. And it was during the special sessions in 2003 that the legislature made various changes, started imposing the modified business tax, changed the casino entertainment tax to the live entertainment tax, which generated additional revenue, which was at the time the largest tax increase in the state's history. And so you can see that kind of growth going through up until 2007, and then it falls off in 2008 and 2009, and that's as a result of the Great Recession. But then in 2010 and 11, it goes back up due to some revenue measures that were passed by the legislature during several special sessions in 2009 and 2010. Such as imposing a room tax of up to 3% through Initiative Petition 1, which originally went to the State General Fund, which now goes to the State Education Fund, as well as the increase in the depreciation schedule for the government services tax, which I mentioned when I went through the tax actions in a previous agenda item. And that was done to stabilize revenue through the pandemic. So it kind of bounced along through that point, but then you can see it fall off a little bit in 14 and stabilize in 15. And then in FY 2016 and going forward, you had the increase again, which was as a result of tax actions taken by the legislature during the 2015 session, namely the imposition of the commerce tax and increases to the rates for the modified business tax. So that is what caused the increases there, which went again through the pandemic, and then in FY 2020, because of the pandemic, it fell off again. But then after that, you can see the growth that has resulted, not necessarily from any tax actions that were taken by the legislature, but the economic activity that has occurred in Nevada that was beyond the forecast that we could have come up with during the pandemic. And I believe Senator Neal has a question.
So just really quick, I love these, thank you. Okay, so on IP1, is there like later on, can you show it's a line of the diversion of room tax for the Raider Stadium?
Madam Chair, Senator Neal, Michael Nakamoto for the record, there was not a diversion of room tax revenue as a result of the stadium. When the legislature approved the bill in the special session for the stadium, they actually approved two distinct rates for the room tax that were separate from any currently imposed rates, one of them for the stadium and one of them for the expansion and improvements to the convention center. So there's not a diversion of the revenue. What I would be able to go and show you, and we'd have to go back and look at the history, is there is a point where the room tax stopped going to the state general fund and instead went to education, to the state supplemental school support fund, which then through legislative actions ended up going to the state distributive school account. I would have to go back and tell you exactly when that happened, but that might explain some of the reductions in revenue, maybe in FY 2012 or thereabouts. That might have been about the point where that occurred. Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, for the record, Michael Nakamoto. On page 158 on chart 3, this is taking those current dollars or the general fund revenue that we showed in chart 2 and have now turned it into per capita. So it's taken the dollar amounts that were generated for the state general fund and dividing it by the state population, both in nominal terms as well as inflation adjusted. Or current dollars and inflation adjusted. So you can see the similar pattern there, that you can see those spikes when there are revenue actions, or in the case of FY 21 and 22, just the economic activity really picked up. But then in inflation adjusted dollars, it started around that $650 per capita that I mentioned in the table, and it decreased, but it's kind of bounced around that, and I believe now we're around $685. So we're in inflation adjusted per capita terms, we're 5% or so above where we were in FY 1990. Chart 4 is basically taking charts 2 and 3 and putting them together in the same line so you can see the magnitude. Because of the scaling issues, those current dollars and inflation adjusted dollars are in millions of dollars, whereas the current dollars per capita and the inflation adjusted dollars per capita are shown just as whole dollars. There's no millions involved there, but to show them on the same line so you could see everything together. And again, you can see the distinct patterns in all 4 of the lines based on revenue changes or coming out of the pandemic. Chart 5 is basically chart 4, but instead of showing dollars, we've indexed everything to 1990. So the number in 1990 is 1 for all 4 lines. But then you can see, for example, the current dollar line, the green line that turns into the red line for the forecast, that it's somewhere around 7.3, between 7.3 and 7.4, which shows that the FY25 forecast in just current dollars is 7.3, 7.4 in that range above or times the general fund in FY 1990. But when you start looking at inflation adjusted dollars and then current dollars per capita, and then when you get down to inflation adjusted dollars per capita, that number is slightly above 1 and below 1.2. It may not even get all the way to 1.1. So when you start looking at the purchasing power of the money and how it needs to be spent to serve the population of the state general fund is slightly better off in those terms of inflation adjusted per capita dollars than we were in FY 1990. And then chart 6 shows the inflation adjusted general fund revenue per capita by fiscal year, and this is indexed to FY 90. So that particular line that I was showing, we've just isolated that and we're showing the movement of it in time. So from FY 90 to FY 2003, in inflation-adjusted per capita terms, the dollar was down to approximately just below 86 cents. But then in FY 2004, you had the tax changes that brought it back above 1 to as high as 1.14, just above that before the recession. And then it came back down to 0.92 or thereabouts in FY 2009. And then the tax and revenue actions that occurred during the recession to kind of bring it back up to that point. But even those were temporary measures. So then you got to FY 2014 and it had fallen down again below 1. And then the 2015 session actions have brought it back up again, temporarily below 1 because of the pandemic, and then the recovery has brought it back up to the point that of about 1.18 in FY 2022. But then you can see that the actual collections for FY 2023 were fell, and then the forecast for 24 and 25 have that falling as well, which suggests that in terms of inflation adjusted per capita, the general fund is forecast to have a little less productivity going forward throughout this biennium at the very least. And then for chart 7 on page 162, basically this is showing the actual dollars that were collected, and that's that green line again. But then what we did is we started at FY90 and said, okay, what happens if we took that FY90 amount and just grew it out at inflation and population, those percentages, where would we be? And so that's kind of, this is a more of a representation of the difference in the previous chart, that gap or the amount above 1. So any time where chart 6 was above 1, you could see the green line on this side be higher than the purple line. But when it went below 1, that's when that green line fell below the purple line, saying that the general fund was less productive than what it would have been just in growth in terms of inflation and population. So these are some of the things that we kind of look at in terms of when somebody asks about productivity of revenues, or what would be what makes a tax more productive than other taxes, is a lot of times they have some demographic components built in a positive fashion, and they have inflationary components that are built in a positive fashion. A good example of that is the sales and use tax. So as the price of goods increases, because the tax for the general fund is 2%, it's based on a percentage of that price. So if something that cost $100 today costs $150 next year, the state general fund is going to get more money out of it because there's more tax paid and we receive 2% of a higher amount. Likewise, it's also good from a population growth aspect also, because as more people move to the state, more of them are going to be consuming these goods. And so as you have more consumers who are buying items that probably cost more, it's more productive for the state general fund. We'll compare this, for example, with something like the cigarette tax, which is taxed at a rate of $1.70 per pack. So there's not an inflation component to the tax rate itself, whether a price or the price of a pack of cigarettes is $5 or whether it's $10, we still collect the same $1.70 per pack. So as the price increases, we don't get any more money. But from a demographic component, that's one where the demographics actually do not work in our favor, because it's probably no secret to all of you that people are smoking less and less every year, whether they're finding substitute products like vaping, or they move to something else that is not cigarettes altogether. We have seen a reduction in the amount of people smoking. Therefore, with fewer people smoking, that demographic goes down. With no inflationary component to the tax rate, it's still $1.70, whether we sell 10 packs or whether we sell 100 packs. That doesn't help. And so as a result, if I were to go show you the history of the cigarette tax, you would see that steadily declining, with a few fiscal years that are exceptions that we could talk about if we were to ever bring that up. So that is kind of the general thoughts that I had with respect to this agenda item. The last thing that I will just show you under this agenda item are some scenarios of kind of how inflation and demographics work in terms of not only of revenues but expenditures. And these were some scenarios that were put together the morning of the first meeting 2 years ago that kind of go through scenarios based on what would happen if you have caseloading increases for programs and funding increases and how that plays with inflation. And I'm not going to go through all the scenarios, but but under scenario one, for example, that if you have a funding or a revenue amount of $100 per year, but you have a caseload of one that you're supporting with that in each fiscal year, and there's no inflation to it, then you're good. Then that amount is going to that $100 that you get is, if it's supported in year one and there's no inflation component to it, then you're good. The revenue is going to support that caseload. But then if, for example, if you get to scenario 4, where you have 100% increase in funding or revenue, but you have a caseload increase of 1, so your caseload increases by 50%, and you have 5% inflation, so your costs go up by 5%. So you have $100 in the first year for that caseload of 1, but then you have $200 in the second year because of that increase in caseload. But 5% inflation says that inflation adjusted, the amount of revenue that you're receiving or the funding, even though it didn't go up, the purchasing power has gone down by about 4.8%. And so what that means is you're trying to fund this, double the caseload with the same amount of money, but your purchasing power of that money goes down. And so that's, as we're looking in terms of the revenues, and especially as the legislature is going to be building budgets going forward, that's kind of the push-pull that you have as legislators. You're trying to support the state with a set of revenues that may or may not be growing with inflation or with demographics, but then as you're funding programs, a lot of which are really driven by caseloads, by inflation, by demographics, by population, Medicaid, K-12 education, and things like that. And so those are the things, just as part of this agenda item, we just wanted to bring in as just items of interest for the members of this committee. So with that, Madam Chair, I will wrap up, and if there are any questions, I would be glad to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Committee members, do we have any questions regarding agenda item, I believe we're on 10? With that, I'll take a comment. Oh, go ahead, Senator Sievers-Ganser.
Thank you. I appreciate all the data and the review of general fund. I think it's just important at some point in time, the committee should probably look at total revenue sources, because we've got substantial federal dollars, excuse me, and other dollars that come in. So our budget, even if it looks like it's 5-point-something billion, it's usually closer to $24 billion because of all the different sources. And it would be interesting at some point in time, of course not today, to look at the overall growth of dollars spent, revenue to dollars spent in Nevada through the government, through state government. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. One of the things that I will make an observation on in response to Senator Sievers-Gansert's comments is that the Fiscal Analysis Division does have a requirement to perform stress testing. And so we are still working on a lot of the parameters and scope of that. But I believe at some point as we get later into the interim and closer to the session, we will have the ability to come back and give you some of the results of the stress testing, which is going to, it may not involve all of the funds, but I think the intent is to look at things more than just the state general fund, but we can have discussions on that as we go forward.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I think Senator Neal is going to take her comment offline. With that, we will go ahead. If there's no other further questions or comments regarding agenda item 10, we'll go ahead and move on to agenda item 11, which are discussions of topics to study during the 2023-24 interim. The committee may request up to 10 bill draft requests for the 2025 session that addresses issues related to revenue. Our interim meetings allow us to take a deep dive into the issues that come before us during this session. While we don't have to use all 10 BDRs, we do have up to the end of August to discuss any of those items that we may wish to consider at that time. Some items that we've kind of preliminary set going forward, just to kind of give you some ideas. In February, we've invited our economic development groups, including the Nevada Development Authority, EDON, and other organizations, LVGEA, to look at what policy is working for them, what policy may not be working, as well as addressing maybe constituent concerns with economic development. And so they will be making presentations before us in February. We may need them coming back, as well as other organizations, depending on the policies that they may raise and discuss. Another item, and I thank Senator Sievers-Gansert for raising the issue. One thing I did want to discuss is I know in 2021 session there was a bill passed by Senator Harris regarding stress tests. Now that the economic fiscal staff does have that extra person, I understand they're able to start looking at that. So that was something we've invited for discussion, but that will obviously take place later in the summer or later in our term before August. But with that, I'm happy to open it up to our members should they have any suggestions of areas that they would wish for us to consider during this interim.
Thank you, Chair. One thing that I was thinking about when Mr. Nakamoto presented the last slide on the inflation, the effect of inflation on some programs, I'm wondering if that modeling can be crossed over into all other budgets. Like, so when we look at health, like they're going to tell us what that inflationary cost is when they have a caseload change, so that we can really see what is the dollar amount that should be expended. I don't know if that's possible. I don't even think that's the jurisdiction of this committee. But I'm just wondering, because inflation seems to be the death of our life, right? I mean, and it seems to be killing everything, and it's super disturbing. And I just want to know if that's even possible. But I don't think that's this committee. I think that's budget. That's ways. Yeah, never mind.
I appreciate that, and I know we've had some communications regarding other topics. Does anyone up in Carson City wish to add or weigh in on areas and topics that you would like to see studied during the 23-24 interim? With that, and we're always open, we can have these discussions at our next meeting in November. And with that, this will move to agenda item
Madam Chair.
12. I think that's Senator Donate coming in. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, Fabian Nunate, for the record. I did have 3 topics that they were brought up during some of the hearings that we had during the legislative session, and so I think it would be of interest for the committee to look at. The first one that I would mention is the state highway fund. I know that the increase of electric vehicles has caused interest in trying to figure out what the highway fund would look like into the future. And so states are starting to look at what are some metrics that we have to have for vehicles that might not pay for gasoline inside. That would be one subject area. The second one is there is going to be a continuation, I believe, of film tax credits. And so it would be interesting to see if we can invite other states to present on how tax credits have evolved in their jurisdictions and their economies, especially as there's a top level tax credit that exists for film companies, but there's also some tax credits that some states have looked at, for instance, for neighborhoods that become sites for potential films or film sites. So that would be my second request. And then the third and final request, kind of alongside the conversations of Senator Neal and what was brought forth today, I think persistently as committee chairs and as legislators, we see the report every year of companies that receive certain amount of tax credits for building new infrastructure, et cetera, but then they also end up on the report that we receive of individuals and citizens that are receiving SNAP benefits, et cetera. And so I think we need to do a deeper dive in terms of figuring out what those incentives are that we have already approved, seeing what the capacity will be for setting a ceiling of how many tax credits we should approve, and then diving down and making sure that the employees that they're hiring aren't enrolling into Medicaid or other government services that the taxpayers are funding. And so that would be my request for those three subject areas.
Thank you so much, Senator Donate, for your thoughtful topics that you would like to explore during the interim, and we will look to see how we can get this scheduled for upcoming meetings. So thank you for that. With that, we'll go ahead and turn to agenda item 12, which is scheduling of the future meetings. This committee must conclude its work by August 31st, 2024, and the Legislative Commission has allotted the committee to hold up to 6 meetings during the interim period. Our meetings will be held in Las Vegas and video conference to Carson City, with the exception of the April meeting. The tentative meetings are scheduled as follows: Wednesday, February 28th at 9 a.m., Wednesday, April 10th, at 1 p.m. And this is the meeting that will be primarily held in Carson City with video conference down here in Las Vegas, just because IFC is actually scheduled that next day on April 11th. And then we'll have a meeting in June on June 20th at 9 a.m. We'll have one July 23rd at 9 a.m. And our last meeting will be August 27th at 9 a.m. At this time, we will go ahead and move to agenda item 13, which is public comment. I would now like to open the meeting for public comment. Is there anyone here in Las Vegas who would like to provide public comment? I don't see anyone. Is there anyone in Carson City who wishes to provide public comment? BPS, is there anyone on the phone who wishes to provide public comment?
Thank you, Chair. The public lines are open and working. However, there are no callers to offer public comment at this time.
Thank you so much. We will go ahead and close public comment. We will move on to agenda item 14, which is adjournment. Our next meeting will be on Wednesday, February 28th, 2024, beginning at 9 a.m. We will hear presentations from the Governor's Office of Economic Development and various economic development entities in the state. Committee members, that concludes our meeting for today. I appreciate everyone's time today, and we are adjourned.